On the morning of July 19, 1994, the most heavily monitored airspace in the Western world simply ceased to exist for 400 seconds. It wasn't a blackout, and it wasn't a mechanical failure. Deep within the steel-reinforced corridors of the O'Hare Terminal Radar Approach Control, or TRACON, the digital heartbeat of the Midwest flatlined. Every transponder signal from over 300 aircraft was simultaneously erased from the mainframe. There was no static, no warning, only an anomaly so absolute that it defied the fundamental laws of surveillance. This was a classified event, hidden behind layers of encrypted telemetry logs and non-disclosure agreements that have held firm for over 30 years. Somewhere in a forgotten sub-basement of the Department of Transportation, a single file remains, documenting a hidden truth that modern aviation refuses to acknowledge. For 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the sky was a void, and the objects within it were no longer subject to the flow of time as we understand it. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of a server room, a low-frequency vibration that settles deep in the chest. The air in the archive is cold, kept at a precise 55 degrees to preserve paper that was never meant to be read. As the heavy steel drawer slides open, the scent of ozone and fading ink fills the space. The folder is heavy, its edges frayed, holding the weight of a silence that lasted much longer than 400 seconds. A faint monitor flicker casts a pale blue light across the first page, where the word "redacted" has been stamped in a dry, crumbling crimson dot. To understand the July 19th discrepancy, one must first understand the chilling precision of 1990s air traffic technology. It was an era of transition, the bridge between the analog world and the digital frontier. The host computer system, or HCS, was the brain of the FAA's en route centers. It was a monolith of vacuum tubes and early silicon, a machine that thrived on the predictable physics of motion. It calculated vectors, altitudes, and speeds with a cold, mathematical certainty. But at 3:14 a.m., that certainty evaporated. The shift change had just occurred. The air traffic controllers, men and women trained to handle the high-pressure environment of the world's busiest hubs, were settling into their dim, circular pods, the green glow of the CRT screens reflected in their tired eyes. Outside, the Chicago night was clear, the atmosphere stable. There were no storms, no solar flares, and no reported electronic interference. Everything was normal, until the moment it wasn't. A senior controller, whose name was later erased from the official personnel logs, noticed it first. It began with a subtle digital glitch on Sector 42, a United Airlines flight. A Boeing 727 cruising at 32,000 feet began to stutter on the screen. In the technical manuals, this is known as target coasting, when the computer loses a solid lock and guesses the plane's position based on its last known speed. But the computer wasn't guessing. It was retreating. Within 3 seconds, the coasting symbols spread like a contagion. One by one, the alphanumeric blocks representing tail numbers, altitudes, and headings began to blink out. It wasn't a crash of the software. The software was running perfectly. It was the data itself that had vanished. The radar arrays in Carpentersville, Elgin, and Roberts were still rotating, sending out their invisible pulses of electromagnetic energy, but nothing was bouncing back. It was as if the aluminum and steel of 300 planes had suddenly become as transparent as the air. Around them, the room fell into a silence that was more terrifying than any alarm. There is a specific kind of quiet dread that takes hold when the experts realize their instruments are no longer tethered to reality. The controllers stared at their scopes. The sweep of the radar line continued its rhythmic circle, but it moved across a black canvas. No weather, no primary targets, no secondary transponders, just a total, harrowing absence. As the second minute of the void began, the technical lead at O'Hare initiated Protocol 0. This was a theoretical emergency procedure designed for total system destruction. But the system wasn't destroyed. The lights were on, the cooling fans were spinning, the internal clocks of the HCS were still ticking, but the sky was empty. In the frantic, whispered conversations that followed, recorded on the internal hotlines, the confusion is palpable. "We have no primary," repeat, "we have no primary returns," one voice says. The tone is not one of panic, but of a deep, intellectual shivering. Outside, in the physical world, the pilots of United Flight 702 and Delta Flight 114 were experiencing something even more unsettling. According to the few leaked documents that survived the subsequent purge, the cockpits of these aircraft underwent a subtle transformation. The stars above the Midwestern plains, usually sharp and distant, seemed to blur into long, vertical streaks of light. The sound of the engines, a constant, comforting roar, shifted in pitch, descending into a subsonic vibration that the pilots felt in their teeth. Captain Elias Thorne, a veteran with 20,000 hours in the air, reported in a later, classified interview that the cockpit instruments didn't fail, they simply stopped measuring. The altimeter stayed at 32,000. The airspeed indicator froze at 480 knots, but the sensation of movement had vanished. It felt, Thorne described, like we were suspended in a block of cold glass. We weren't flying through the air, we were part of the air. Back at the Traken Center, the 400-second timer was counting up. In the archives, this period is referred to as the static window. It is the only time in recorded aviation history where the FAA cannot account for the physical location of multiple wide-body aircraft. During this window, several ground-based observers in rural Illinois reported seeing long, dark ribbons in the sky, objects that didn't reflect light, but seemed to absorb it. These reports were later dismissed by the official inquiry as atmospheric refraction, but the archival researcher knows better. Refraction doesn't leave physical traces. It doesn't cause mechanical watchers to lose exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds of time, while the digital clocks on the planes continue as normal. The cold air of the storage facility seems to grow heavier as you read further into the logs. The researchers found that during the static window, the ground-to-air radio frequencies didn't just go silent, they became occupied. Controllers, who kept their headsets on, reported hearing a sound like distant, rhythmic breathing layered over a high-pitched digital whine. It was a frequency that shouldn't have been possible to broadcast on aviation bands. It was as if the void itself was trying to communicate a state of being that the human ear wasn't designed to process. At exactly 6 minutes and 41 seconds after the initial drop, the radar screens at O'Hare flickered. A single faint static pop echoed through the control room, and the sky returned, but it didn't return as it had left. The alphanumeric blocks reappeared in a chaotic swarm. Proximity alarms began to scream throughout the facility as the computer struggled to reconcile the new positions of the aircraft. For the controllers, the shock of the disappearance was replaced by the horror of the reaction. 3 planes, United 702, Delta 114, and a private Gulfstream were no longer where they were supposed to be, based on their last known speed and heading. These aircraft should have traveled approximately 54 miles during the blackout. However, when the radar lock stabilized, all 3 aircraft were discovered to be exactly 66 miles from their last known coordinates. They had covered an additional 12 miles in a span of time that didn't exist. This is the 12-mile jump, a phenomenon that remains the most guarded secret of the July 19th discrepancy. In the world of physics, this is an impossibility. To travel that extra distance in that time frame, the aircraft would have had to exceed the speed of sound by a factor that would have torn the airframes apart. Yet, there was no sonic boom. There was no structural damage. There was only the hidden truth hidden in the fuel logs. When the planes eventually landed, the ground crews discovered that none of the 3 aircraft had consumed a single drop of fuel during the 400 seconds they were missing. They hadn't flown the 66 miles. They had simply arrived as the pilots began their descent. Unaware of the miracle or the curse they had just navigated, a secondary symptom began to manifest. It started with the cabin crew. In Delta 114, the flight attendants reported a sudden, overwhelming sense of nausea and disorientation. But it wasn't motion sickness. It was a feeling of being in the wrong place. When they looked at the passengers, they saw something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The passengers were still asleep, but it was a sleep so deep, so absolute, that it resembled a state of suspended animation. Their skin was cold to the touch. Their breathing was so shallow it was nearly undetectable. And most disturbingly, charcoal suits. These weren't FAA inspectors. They didn't carry clipboards or badges. They carried classified agreements and a set of instructions that were to be followed without question. The flight recorders, the famous black boxes, were pulled from the aircraft before the engines had even cooled. In the official record, these boxes were listed as corrupted by a localized electromagnetic surge. But the Archive Chill Collective has uncovered a different story. The boxes weren't corrupted. They were full of data that the government could not allow to exist in a public database. The cockpit voice recorders didn't capture the sound of the pilots talking during the 400 seconds. Instead, they captured the sound of the environment, a sound that some researchers have described as the hum of the universe's source code. It was a mechanical, repetitive thrumming that matched the frequency of the breathing heard by the controllers on the ground. In the decades since 1994, The July 19th discrepancy has been scrubbed from most digital archives. If you search for it, you will find 404 error pages or dry reports about a minor software upgrade at O'Hare. But the physical evidence remains for those who know where to look. In the suburbs of Chicago, there are still people now elderly who remember that night. They remember the way the television signal turned into a strange, geometric pattern for 6 minutes. They remember the way their dogs began to howl at a sky that looked too dark. The deeper you go into the file, the more you realize that the July 19th discrepancy wasn't an accident. It was a symptom of a larger, more terrifying reality. Our world, our sky, is maintained by systems both technological and natural that are far more fragile than we are led to believe. Every so often, the system stutters. Every so often the data is erased. The question that keeps the archival researchers awake at night is not why the planes jumped 12 miles. The question is, where did they go during those 400 seconds? And more importantly, what brought them back? Some believe that the static window was a moment where the absolute zero of the vacuum leaked into our atmosphere. Others suggest it was a test of a surveillance technology so advanced it could manipulate the fabric of space-time itself. But there is one final detail in the file. A note scribbled in the margin of the final page. It mentions a passenger from Flight 702, a woman who, 3 days after the incident, began to insist that she could still see the static window. She claimed that whenever she closed her eyes, she didn't see darkness. She saw the radar screen at O'Hare. She saw the blinking numbers. And she saw the 400-second timer still counting up, as if for her, the void had never ended. As we close this chapter of the July 19th discrepancy, the silence in the archive feels heavier than before. We have documented the jump, the void, and the erased data, but the most unsettling part of the report wasn't what happened in the sky. It was what the ground crews found inside the cargo hold of United 702, a series of wooden crates, manifested as agricultural samples, that had been tampered with from the inside during the 400 seconds of non-existence. To understand what was in those crates, we must look at the next redacted entry in the archive, the 400-second pulse, when radar went flat, and the biological horror that was left behind in the terminal. On the early morning of July 19, 1994, something happened on the radar screens of Chicago's O'Hare Airport that shook the foundations of modern aviation history. Every classified file and encrypted telemetry log reveals that at exactly 3:14 a.m., a silent pulse effectively blocked the entire airspace. For exactly 400 seconds, the radar screens went completely flat. This was no ordinary technical failure. It was an absolute zero anomaly. Every aircraft's tracking data, transponder signal, and identification code were simultaneously erased from the mainframe. There was no warning, no faint static, only a hollow, terrifying silence that paralyzed the controllers. The government's hidden truth remains locked within these folders, documenting a reality that shouldn't exist. This file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the server room is a cold, rhythmic hum. The constant worry of computer fans creates a chilling atmosphere that settles into the bones. These files from the archive are still cold, as if they were pulled from deep storage moments ago. The scent of old ink and the texture of faded paper suggest that these secrets have been suppressed for decades. A faint monitor flicker casts a pale blue light across the desk, where the word redacted is stamped harshly on the very first page. The ink is dry, but the weight of what it hides is immense. In the history of aviation technology, 1994 was a year of profound transition. It was the bridge between the analog past and the digital future. The FAA's host computer system, or HCS, was a massive, brutal monolith of early computing. It was a complex blend of vacuum tubes and early silicon, a machine that functioned on pure mathematical logic. It divided the sky into coordinates, vectors, and altitudes, maintaining order through cold, calculated precision. But on July 19th, at birth 3:14 a.m., every thread of that logic was severed. At O'Hare's tracking center, the shift change had just occurred. The controllers were settled into their dim, circular pods, staring intently at the scopes. The green glow of the CRT screens reflected in their tired eyes. The Chicago sky was perfectly clear. There were no reported storms, no solar flares, and no technical warnings. Everything was standard. Until the pulse arrived. A senior controller, whose name was later erased from the official records, was the first to notice the deviation. In Sector 42, a United Airlines flight cruising at 32,000 feet began to stutter on the screen. In technical manuals, this is referred to as target coasting, where the computer loses a lock and guesses the position based on the last known speed. But in this case, the computer wasn't guessing. It was retreating. Within 3 seconds, this coasting signal spread across the entire screen like a virus. One by one, every tail number, every altitude code, and every heading block blinked out and vanished. It wasn't a software crash, as the system clocks were still functioning perfectly. The data itself was simply disappearing. The radar arrays and Elgin and Roberts were still sending out their invisible pulses, but nothing was returning from the sky. It was as if 300 aircraft, made of aluminum and steel, had suddenly become as transparent as the air around them. A heavy silence fell over the room. There is a specific kind of quiet dread that takes hold when experts realize their instruments are no longer tethered to physical reality. The sweep line of the radar continued its rhythmic circle, but it moved across a black canvas. No primary targets, no secondary transponders, only a profound, haunting emptiness. During this 400-second window known in the archive as the static window, the FAA had no record of where any of those planes were. The technical lead at O'Hare immediately initiated Protocol 0. This is a theoretical emergency procedure usually reserved for the total physical destruction of the system, but the system wasn't destroyed. The lights were on, the cooling fans were spinning, but the screens were blank. On the internal hotlines, controllers began to whisper. Their voices carried no panic, only a deep, intellectual shivering. They were witnessing the impossible. Outside, in the physical world, the pilots of United 702 and Delta 114 were experiencing a transformation of their own cockpit environment. According to classified logs, the stars over the Midwest suddenly blurred into long vertical streaks of light. The comforting roar of the engines shifted into a subsonic vibration that the pilots could feel in their teeth. Captain Elias Thorne, a veteran with 20,000 hours of flight time, stated in a redacted interview that it wasn't an instrument failure, the instruments simply stopped measuring. The altimeter remained at 32,000 feet. The airspeed was frozen at 480 knots, but the sensation of movement had vanished. Thorne described it as being trapped inside a block of cold glass. They weren't flying through the air. They had become part of the air itself. Back at the Tracon Center, the 400-second timer continued to count up. In rural Illinois, ground observers reported seeing long dark ribbons in the sky, objects that did not reflect light but seemed to actively absorb it. While the official inquiry dismissed these as atmospheric refractions, the archival researchers know that refraction cannot cause a mechanical watch to lose exactly 400 seconds of time. The cold air of the storage facility feels heavier as you turn the pages. The research indicates that during the static window, ground-to-air frequencies weren't just silent, they were physics. This is impossible. To travel that distance in that time, the planes would have needed to exceed the speed of sound. Yet there were no sonic booms and no structural damage. The hidden truth was found in the fuel logs. Upon landing, ground crews realized that not a single drop of fuel had been consumed during those 400 seconds. The planes hadn't flown. They had simply arrived at a new set of coordinates. When the passengers finally landed, a new anomaly was discovered. They would not wake up. Their sleep was so deep it resembled suspended animation. Their skin was cold. Most disturbingly, every person wearing a mechanical, when Dugwatch found that their timepiece had stopped. Exactly at 3:14 a.m., the digital watches remained accurate, but the physical gears had been frozen by the pulse. Within 2 hours of landing, the FAA were sidelined by men in dark suits. No badges were shown, only classified non-disclosure agreements. The black boxes were pulled while the engines were still warm. The official report claimed the boxes were corrupted, but the archive reveals they actually recorded the source code of the universe, that same rhythmic breathing, heard by the controllers. Since 1994, this incident has been systematically scrubbed from digital history. Searches result in 404 errors or dry software reports, but the physical evidence remains in the memories of the elderly residents of the Chicago suburbs. They remember the television signals turning into geometric patterns. They remember the dogs howling at a sky that looked too dark. The deeper one goes into the file, the more it becomes clear that this was no accident. It was a fracture in reality. Our world is maintained by a fragile system, and sometimes that system stutters. The data is erased, but the question remains, where were they for those 400 seconds? And did they bring something back with them? A small note on the final page of the file mentions a passenger from Flight 702. 3 days after the incident, she began to insist she could still see the static window. She claimed that when she closed her eyes, she saw the radar screen and the timer, still counting up. For her, the void had never ended. The investigation into the mechanical watches became a focal point for the underground researchers. Why would a digital quartz watch continue to tick while a mechanical balance wheel stopped? The answer suggests that the 400-second pulse didn't just affect electronics, it affected the very nature of inertia. In a world of absolute zero anomaly, physical movement, the literal swinging of a gear, becomes impossible. The archive contains a subfile on kinetic freezing. It suggests that during the pulse, the molecules of the aircraft and everything inside them reached a state of perfect stillness, even as they moved through space. This is the ultimate paradox of the July 19th incident. How can something move 12 miles while being perfectly still? As you sit in the silence of the archive, the monitor flicker seems to sync with your own heartbeat. You realize that the 400-second pulse wasn't a one-time event. It was a test, a measurement of how much of our reality can be removed before the structure collapses. The technicians who stayed in the room that night never spoke of it again, but their medical records show a strange pattern. Every one of them developed a heightened sensitivity to low-frequency hum. They could hear the breathing of the building, the breathing of the city. There is a specific entry in the Traken log from 3:18 a.m., right in the middle of the blackout. It is a single line of text that was missed by the initial sensors. It reads, "The targets are not gone. They are overlapping." This suggests a horrifying alternative. The planes didn't disappear into a void. They were still there, but they had occupied the same physical coordinates simultaneously. The absolute zero wasn't an absence of data, but an infinite density of it. 300 planes, thousands of people, all compressed into a single, mathematical point for 400 seconds. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that the jump wasn't the planes moving forward, but the planes being unfolded back into our reality at the wrong exit point. The 12-mile discrepancy was simply a margin of error in the unfolding process. To add another layer to this hidden truth, we must look at the civilian reports from the ground. Rural Illinois in 1994 was a place of quiet farms and long, dark highways. At 3:15 a.m., multiple witnesses called local sheriff departments to report that the wind had stopped. Not just died down, it had stopped completely. The leaves on the trees froze in midair. The sound of insects vanished. One witness, a farmer named Miller, reported that his cattle all turned to face O'Hare Airport at the same time. They stood in perfect silence, unmoving, until the 400 seconds were over. This indicates that the pulse had a physical radius that extended far beyond the radar range. It was a localized bubble of non-time when the long, dark ribbons appeared in the sky. Miller described them not as aircraft, but as tears in the fabric of the night. He said it looked as if someone had taken a knife to the sky and revealed a cold, gray void behind the stars. In the weeks following July 19th, the FAA performed a global system reset. This was publicly described as a routine maintenance update to prepare for the increased traffic of the late 90s. In reality, it was an attempt to install reality buffers in the software code, designed to ignore spatial jumps and telemetry anomalies. The government realized that they couldn't stop the pulses, so they decided to make the system blind to them. If a plane jumps 12 miles today, the modern radar software is programmed to smooth out the data so the controller never sees the glitch. The hidden truth is that these anomalies are likely happening every day, hidden behind the sleek, digital interfaces of modern air traffic control. The woman from Flight 702, mentioned in the final note, became a subject of intense study for a shadowy organization known only as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity. Her case file is the most heavily encrypted part of the archive. She claimed that she could feel the static in her teeth whenever she flew. She eventually disappeared from public record in late 1996. Her last known statement to her sister was, "The 400 seconds didn't end, we just learned how to sleep through them." This creates a lingering sense of reflection. Are we currently living through a static window? Is the reality we see around us merely the smoothed-out data of a system that is constantly stuttering? The archive offers no comfort, only more questions. As we conclude this deep dive into the 400-second pulse, the atmosphere in the room remains cold and analytical. We have looked at the technical failures, the biological stasis, and the government cover. We have seen how 12 miles can disappear, and how fuel can remain unburned while engines roar. The Tier 1 audience, seeking the truth behind the curtain, must understand that the absolute zero anomaly is the ultimate proof that our surveillance of the world is an illusion. We only see what the system allows us to see. When the radar goes flat, the truth emerges, and the truth is a void that is 400 seconds long and 12 miles wide. The documents are now being returned to their steel folders. The monitor flicker slows. and the server room hum remains the only witness to these words. We have documented the pulse, but the pulse was only the beginning. The 400-second pulse was a terrifying display of systemic failure, but it was merely a symptom of a much deeper, biological crisis. While the radar went flat, something was happening to the DNA of the people on board. The most disturbing evidence didn't come from the cockpit or the radar room, it came from the medical examiner's report on the agricultural samples found in the cargo hold. To understand the true cost of the July 19th incident, we must turn to the next file, Ghost Coordinates, 3 planes that jumped 12 miles and the discovery of the passengers who came back with 2 heartbeats. In the rigid, mathematical world of aviation telemetrics, distance is a non-negotiable function of time and velocity. It is a physical law that dictates every flight path across the globe. Yet, tucked inside the classified records of July 19, 1994, is an anomaly that threatens to dismantle our understanding of spacetime itself. On that night, 3 commercial aircraft were effectively erased from existence for 400 seconds, only to reappear in what investigators now call ghost coordinates. These were not just geographical errors, there were spatial displacements that shouldn't be physically possible. The encrypted telemetry logs prove that these planes covered an extra 12 miles of distance during their disappearance, or without consuming a single drop of fuel or experiencing a single second of acceleration. This is the hidden truth the FAA has spent 30 years trying to bury for nearly 7 minutes. 3,000 people occupied a space where the rules of the universe were suspended. The file documenting this impossible jump was hidden behind layers of state-mandated silence. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight. Page here, the text is dense, clinical, and unapologetically analytical. There is a sense of quiet dread in the margins, where handwritten notes from a long-dead researcher ask questions that the official report refused to answer. You can almost feel the weight of the silence as you read the first line. Incident 94 Delta. The spatial discontinuity. To understand the ghost coordinates, one must look at the specific telemetry of United Flight 702. At 3:14 a.m., the aircraft was located 54 miles from the O'Hare approach gate. When the absolute zero pulse hit, the radar went black. For 400 seconds, there was no signal, no primary echo, and no communication. When the system finally stabilized and the radar sweep returned, Flight 702 was not at the 66-mile mark where its speed should have placed it. It was at the 78-mile mark. This is the 12-mile jump. In a standard vacuum, this would be a simple accounting error. But in the world of high-velocity aviation, 12 miles is an eternity. For Flight 702 to have covered that extra distance in that time frame, it would have needed to exceed the speed of sound by a factor that would have shredded the aluminum wings from the fuselage. Yet, there were no sonic booms recorded by ground stations. There was no sudden jolt reported by the flight recorders. The plane simply existed in a new location. The term ghost coordinates refers to the fact that the aircraft did not occupy the space between mile 66 and mile 7. If a camera had been pointed at that stretch of sky, it would have seen nothing. The aircraft didn't fly through that airspace. It bypassed it. It was a leap in the geometry of the world. Investigators who spent years analyzing the encrypted flight logs found that the plane's internal inertial navigation system experienced a flatline event. The gyroscopes, which measured the movement of the plane in three-dimensional space, stopped spinning for the duration of the jump. To the plane's own sensors, it hadn't moved an inch, but to the Earth below, it had moved 12 miles. This creates a harrowing paradox for the archival researcher. How does an object move across the Earth without moving through space? The answer lies in the static window. During those 400 seconds, the planes were no longer subject to the friction of the atmosphere or the pull of gravity. They were, in a sense, untethered from our reality. One of the most informative aspects of this case, and the one that Tier 1 audiences find most unsettling, is the fuel consumption data. A Boeing 727 at cruise altitude burns fuel with mathematical regularity. Every minute of flight is a chemical transaction. Fuel is burned, energy is created, and the plane moves forward. But on Flight 702 and Delta 114, the transaction was cancelled. When the planes landed at O'Hare, ground crews performed a routine fuel dip. They discovered that the fuel levels were identical to the levels recorded at 3:14 a.m. The engines had been running, the turbines had been spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. The pilots had heard the roar of the intake, but the fuel tanks remained full. This is what researchers call thermodynamic stasis. It suggests that the engines were not burning fuel to create thrust. Instead, they were mimicking the sound and sensation of thrust while being carried by a larger, invisible force. It is as if the universe's source code had created a placeholder for the planes, moving them across the map while keeping their internal states frozen. A faint static can be heard on the cockpit voice recorders from this period. It isn't the sound of wind or radio interference. It is a rhythmic, oscillating tone that some analysts believe is the sound of the ghost coordinates themselves, a frequency of 44.1 kHz that shouldn't exist in nature. In the archive, this sound is nicknamed the breathing of the void. One pilot, who later spoke under a condition of absolute anonymity, described the sensation as flying through a photograph. He could see the clouds below him, but they weren't shifting. He could see the dials on his panel, but the needles were vibrating in a way that suggested they were trying to move in a direction that didn't exist. He felt a cold air inside the cockpit that didn't come from the air conditioning. It was a cold that seemed to radiate from his own bones. While the technical logs focus on miles and fuel, the most disturbing parts of the classified file deal with the passengers. When the planes landed, the 3,000 people on board were not in a state of panic. They were in a state of profound, eerie calm. Medical reports gathered by the dark suit agencies in the hours following the landing revealed that every passenger's internal biological clock had been reset. It wasn't just their watches that had stopped. It was their cellular aging process. For 400 seconds, their bodies had ceased to function in linear time. Waitresses at the terminal reported that the passengers who disembarked from these flights looked sharper or too clear. They described a visual anomaly where the passengers seemed to have a higher resolution than the people around them. It was as if they had been refreshed by the void. But this clarity came with a price. Within 48 hours, many of these passengers began to complain of sensory overlap. They could hear colors. They could taste the hum of the airport lights. The archive contains a subset of files, labeled the terminal interviews. In these documents, passengers described seeing the ghost coordinates while they were in the air. They didn't see the dark fields of Illinois. They saw a gray geometry, a series of shifting, translucent shapes that moved in time with the breathing sound on the radio. One passenger, a mathematics professor, claimed that for those 12 miles, he finally understood the missing numbers of the universe. He was never able to return to his normal life, eventually disappearing into a government-run psychiatric facility, where he spent the rest of his days drawing circles on the walls. The evidence for the ghost coordinates wasn't just in the sky, it was on the ground. When the mechanics at O'Hare approached United 702, they expected to find a plane that had just completed a standard flight. Instead, they found a machine that felt alien. One mechanic, Marcus V, wrote in a leaked report that the tires of the aircraft were covered in a thin layer of translucent frost. This frost didn't melt in the humid July air of Chicago. In fact, it stayed on the rubber for nearly 3 hours. Analysis of the frost revealed it wasn't made of water. It was a crystalline structure that had no known match on the periodic table. It was a physical remnant of the space between the coordinates. Marcus also noted that the metal skin of the plane was soft to the touch. When he pressed his thumb against the fuselage, the aluminum yielded like warm wax, only to snap back into its rigid shape seconds later. The plane's molecular structure had been temporarily loosened by the jump. This is why the 12-mile jump didn't destroy the airframe. The plane wasn't a solid object during the transition. It was a fluid state of matter, existing as a probability rather than a physical fact. This information was immediately erased from the FAA's public report. Marcus was reassigned to a remote airfield in Alaska, and his original logs were replaced with a typed summary that mentioned only minor hydraulic leaks. But the archival researcher knows that Marcus kept a copy of his notes. Those notes are the only reason we know the truth about the loosening of the steel. The entity responsible for the cleanup was not the FBI or the CIA. It was a specialized, deeply classified group known as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity, BT. The BTI exists for one reason: to ensure that the public never realizes that reality is a fragile, glitchy construct. Their tactical teams moved through O'Hare with surgical precision. They didn't just seize the black boxes, they seized the minds of the witnesses. They used a combination of high-level NDAs and cognitive masking, a technique involving low-frequency sound waves that disrupt the brain's ability to form long-term memories of traumatic or impossible events. This is why, if you ask an O'Hare employee about July 19, 1994, they might tell you it was a boring night or that they don't really remember it. Their memories have been erased by the beat, leaving only a hollow space where the truth used to be. But the ghost coordinates cannot be fully deleted. They exist in the telemetry, in the fuel logs, and in the breathing. frequencies that still haunt the Midwestern airspace. The BTI's own internal audit of the event concluded that the jump was a naturally occurring spatial sinkhole. They warned that as our reliance on digital surveillance grew, these sinkholes would become more apparent. The radar doesn't create the jump, it just makes us notice it. As we look back at the 1994 incident, the intellectual curiosity remains. Why 12 miles? Why 400 seconds? Some theorists in the archive believe that the number 12 is a harmonic of the Earth's magnetic field, a node where the fabric of reality is thin. The cold air in the archive room seems to pulse as you read the final technical appendix. It suggests that the 12 miles weren't jumped at all. Instead, the Earth itself was compressed for those 3 planes. For a brief moment, the distance between. Today, pilots are still trained to report telemetry drift or unexplained vector shifts, but they are also told, off the record, to never look too closely at the numbers. If the GPS says you are 10 miles ahead of where you should be, you simply adjust and move on. You don't ask why. You don't check the fuel logs. You don't look for the frost on the tires. Because once you acknowledge the jump, you become part of the anomaly. You become like Captain Thorne, who spent the rest of his life feeling desynchronized, always hearing the tick of the clock a fraction of a second after it happened. You become a ghost in your own life. There is one final, harrowing detail in the classified file. It concerns the manifest discrepancy. When the 3 planes were counted by the BTI agents at the gate, they found that the total number of people disembarking was 3. That's an N6. The manifest for the 3 flights clearly stated there were 3,000 passengers and crew. 6 extra people walked off those planes. They had no passports, no tickets, and no memories of boarding. They were dressed in clothing that didn't match the fashions of 1994, styles that seemed either archaic or disturbingly futuristic. These unseen passengers were taken into custody immediately and have never been seen again. Who were they? Were they people from the coordinates, or were they versions of the passengers from a different timeline, folded into our reality during the 400-second pulse? The archive has no answer, only a series of redacted names and a single photograph of a man with eyes that seem to be made of faint static. As the archival study of the ghost coordinates comes to a close, the sense of quiet dread remains. We have documented the physics-breaking jump, the fuel that wouldn't burn, and the people who returned changed. We have seen the evidence of a world that is far less solid than it appears. The monitor flicker begins to fade as the archive's power save mode initiates. The steel drawer is ready to be slid back into place, locking these 12 miles of impossible history back into the dark. But the information density of this case stays with you. It is a weight in the mind, a realization that the sky above you is not just air and weather. It is a complex, fragile grid of data, and sometimes, the data skips. We live in the gaps between the coordinates. We sleep in the 400 seconds of the void, and while we may never truly understand what happened over Chicago in 1994, we can no longer ignore the truth that was erased. The file is heavy, the ink is old, but the anomaly is still there, waiting for the next pulse, the next jump, the next moment when the radar goes flat. The mystery of the 12-mile jump ends here, but a far more disturbing discovery was waiting in the shadows of the terminal. While the investigators focused on the spatial displacement of the planes, they missed the subtle, biological transformation occurring inside the passengers' very cells. Something had been planted in the marrow of their bones during those 400 seconds, a rhythmic, ticking secret that was about to manifest in the middle of the crowded O'Hare terminal. The most terrifying part of the July 19th incident wasn't the distance the planes traveled, but the impossible rhythm that began to beat inside every human heart on board, leading to a crisis that the government could no longer contain. When Delta Flight 114 touched down on the tarmac of O'Hare International at 4:12 a.m., the ground crew noticed something impossible before the cabin doors even opened. In the rigid world of forensic physics, time is an unbroken chain of causality, a series of events that occur in a specific, measurable order. Yet, the classified medical files from that morning reveal a disturbing anomaly that suggests the chain was not just broken, but cauterized. Every passenger walked off that plane into the humid dawn of July 19th, but their wrists remained anchored to the dead of night. Their mechanical watches, the timepieces governed by the physical oscillation of balance, wheels and hairsprings, had all stopped at exactly 3:14 a.m. It wasn't a magnetic surge, and it wasn't a localized EMP, it was a failure of the very concept of inertia. The encrypted data shows that for 400 seconds, the act of existing was suspended at a molecular level. This erased history hides a hidden truth. The 3,000 people on those flights weren't just delayed, they were biologically out of sync with the rest of the planet. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, sterile hum of the server room, a white noise that masks the weight of the secrets stored within the steel racks. The air in this archive is cold, kept at a precise temperature to ensure the ink on these redacted pages never smudges, though it has already begun to fade with the passage of 30 years. As you touch the folder, the cardboard is chilling, as if it has been sitting in a vacuum. A monitor flicker from across the room casts a rhythmic, pale blue light onto the first page of the medical examiner's report. There is a faint scent of ozone and old sterile paper. The ink is dry, the margins are filled with frantic, handwritten notes, and a faint static seems to vibrate through the desk. This is the record of the biological lag, a moment when humanity briefly detached from the flow of the universe. To the intellectual observer, the most harrowing detail of the July 19th incident wasn't the radar blackout, but the behavior of the timepieces. In 1994, the world was split between the analog and the digital. On Flight 702, there were 142 passengers. Among them, 64 were wearing mechanical wind-up or automatic watches. Every single one of those 64 watches stopped at the exact moment the radar went flat. 3 hours 14 minutes and 2 seconds, AM. The archival researcher must ask, why? A mechanical watch is a microcosm of Newtonian physics. It relies on the continuous movement of gears, the tension of a spring, and the rhythmic swing of a wheel. For these watches to stop simultaneously without any physical damage to the internal components suggests that, for 400 seconds, the physical laws of motion were rewritten. Gravity and inertia, the forces that keep a balance wheel swinging, simply ceased to apply to the objects inside the plane's fuselage. However, the digital watches, the quartz-based timepieces powered by small lithium batteries, continued to tick. This anomaly provides a terrifying clue. A digital watch counts time through electrical pulses in a crystal. It doesn't rely on physical movement in the same way a gear does. This tells us that while electricity could still move, physical matter could not. The planes, the seats, and the passengers were in a state of kinetic freezing. They were moving through the sky at 500 miles per hour, yet internally, not a single molecule was allowed to shift. The cold air in the archive seems to tighten as you read the technical addendum. It suggests that the pulse didn't just stop the watches, it stopped the very oscillation of the atoms within the passengers' bodies. This is the absolute zero of existence. If the mechanical watches stopped because their gears couldn't move, we must confront the reality of what happened to the human hearts on board. The classified medical logs from the O'Hare Infirmary, which operated under a code black lockdown that morning, describe the condition of the arriving passengers as physiologically stagnant. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead examiner, whose name was later erased from the medical board registry, noted that the passengers disembarking from the 3 affected flights showed no signs of standard fatigue, despite the traumatic nature of the flight. When he took their vitals, he found a terrifying consistency. The passengers' body temperatures were exactly 98.6 degrees, not a fraction higher or lower across 300 test subjects. Their blood pressure was uniform, but the most disturbing discovery was the respiratory delay. Thorne noted that for the first 30 minutes after landing, the passengers only breathed once every 60 seconds. Their lungs were moving with a mechanical, deliberate slowness, as if they were being manually restarted by their own nervous systems. The encrypted logs refer to this as the biological lag. Their bodies were still trying to catch up to the 400 seconds they had spent in the void. In that space, they hadn't breathed at all. They hadn't needed to. Their cells had entered a state of oxygen independence, because the chemical reactions that require oxygen, the very process of life, had been paused. The faint static on the archive's audio recordings of these interviews is bone-chilling. You can hear the rhythmic, slow breathing of a passenger in the background. It sounds less like a human and more like the slow, heavy cycling of an industrial bellows. The passenger, a 34-year-old woman from Chicago, tells the doctor, "I don't feel like I'm here yet. I can see you, but I feel like I'm still back there, in the dark, waiting for the clock to move." This creates a sense of quiet dread. If the passengers were biologically frozen, then for 400 seconds, they were effectively dead. Yet, they were walking, talking, and eventually screaming. As the dawn progressed, and the passengers were moved into the secure holding area of Terminal 5, a new phenomenon began to manifest. This is the part of the hidden individual consciousness into a single, collective data point. The monitor flicker in the archive room seems to pulse in time with the description of this event. The researchers called it the harmonic core, because their biological clocks had all been reset to the same moment, 3:14 a.m. Their bodies were now vibrating on the same frequency. They were no longer 300 individuals. They were a single biological anomaly distributed across 300 bodies. One guard, who was stationed at the door, reported that the sound of their heartbeats was so loud it could be heard through the reinforced glass. But it wasn't the sound of 300 hearts. It was the sound of one massive, thunderous heart, beating once every 10 seconds, a single, unified thump that vibrated the floorboards of the terminal. The intellectual curiosity of the BTI Bureau of Temporal Integrity. Agents led them to a desperate experiment. They brought in a mechanical watch that had been stopped during the flight and placed it in the center of the room. Within minutes, the watch began to tick again, but it wasn't ticking to the correct time. It was ticking in sync with the passengers' heartbeats. The biological lag was so powerful that it was rewriting the physical laws of the room, forcing mechanical objects to obey the new, distorted timeline of the survivors. Deep in the medical there is an entry regarding sample 94-07. This was a blood sample taken from a flight attendant on Delta 114. When the technician attempted to perform a standard CBC complete blood count, the blood refused to react to the chemical reagents. More disturbingly, when the blood was placed under a microscope, the red blood cells were not moving. In a living sample, cells should exhibit Brownian motion, a constant, jittery movement, but these cells were perfectly still, arranged in a geometric pattern that resembled a crystal lattice. The classified analysis states, the subject's blood is no longer a liquid, it is a structured information carrier. The biological lag had transformed the very essence of their biology into a recording of the 400-second pulse. Their blood was no longer transporting oxygen, it was transporting the static of the void. When the technician accidentally pricked her finger on the slide, she didn't just experience a minor injury. Within hours, her own watch, a high-end mechanical timepiece, stopped at exactly 3:14 a.m. The anomaly was contagious. It wasn't a virus or a bacteria. It was a chronological contamination. The static window was spreading through contact with the biological remains of the event. This is why the terminal was immediately incinerated and rebuilt under the guise of modernization. Every surface, every carpet fiber, every drop of sweat had to be erased to prevent the 3:14 a.m. pulse from leaking into the general population of Chicago. The cold air of the archive feels even more biting as you realize that the modern O'Hare Airport is built on the ashes of a biological crime scene. The hidden truth of the agricultural samples mentioned in previous logs finally comes to light. In this section of the archive, these were not plants or seeds. They were cryogenically preserved tissue samples from a project known as Genesis Zero, being transported to a laboratory in Maryland. During the 400 seconds of the void, these samples underwent a spontaneous reanimation. The internal logs of the cargo hold showed that the temperature inside the crates spiked to 104 degrees, even while the rest of the plane was freezing. When the ground crew opened the crates, they didn't find tissue samples. They found a mass of semi-translucent pulsating matter that had mimicked the shape of the internal cargo hold. The biological lag had allowed these samples to grow at an accelerated rate, fueled by the temporal energy of the pulse. They had eaten the 400 seconds of missing time and used it as a biological catalyst. The report states that the matter was vibrating at 44.1 kHz, the same frequency as the breathing heard on the radar. The most horrifying realization for the researchers was that this matter was not alien, it was human. It was an amalgamation of the passenger's DNA, pulled from the air in the seats during the stasis, and reconstructed inside the crates. The static window hadn't just paused life, it had attempted to rewrite it as the years passed. The survivors of the July 19th incident were kept under constant surveillance by the BTI. The erased personnel files showed that none of them lived past the year 2004, but they didn't die of natural causes, they simply faded. Medical observers noted that every year, on the anniversary of the flight, the survivors would become slightly more translucent. Their physical density would decrease. By the 10th year, one survivor was reported to have zero shadow. Light passed through his body as if he were made of thin glass. The biological lag was finally catching up to them. The 400 seconds they had borrowed from the universe were being taken back, second by second, year by year. They were being pulled back into the coordinates where they had been lost. Their watches had stopped in 1994, and eventually, their hearts followed. The monitor flicker in the archive room grows frantic as you reach the final pages. There are photographs of the survivors in their final days. They don't look like people. They look like faint static captured in a human shape. Their eyes are wide, reflecting a grey luminescence that doesn't exist in our world. The last recorded words of a passenger from Flight 702 were, "The timer is almost at 400. When it hits, I finally get to move again." The archival study of the biological lag forces us to confront the fragility of our own existence. We define life by movement, the beating of a heart, the ticking of a watch, the flow of blood. But the July 19th incident proves that movement is a privilege granted by a system we do not control. When that system fails, we are left in the absolute zero. We become ghost coordinates in a biological sense. The hidden truth is that our bodies are just data points in a massive, cosmic mainframe, and sometimes, the mainframe suffers a pulse. The Tier 1 audience, those who seek to understand the unseen history of the world, must recognize that the biological lag is still among us. It exists in the unexplained medical cases of people who stop aging, or people whose watches never seem to keep the correct time. It is the legacy of the static window. The air in the archive is now so cold that your breath mists the paper. The hum of the servers sounds like a heavy, rhythmic breathing. You realize that the archive itself might be in sync with the pulse. The folders, the ink, the steelets, all part of the record, and the record is still being written. The final page of the file is almost entirely blacked out. Only one sentence remains visible at the very bottom, written in a different hand than the rest of the report. The lag is not a delay, it is a countdown. This realization shifts the quiet dread into a cold, academic terror. If the biological lag is a countdown, then the events of July 19, 1994, were not the end of the anomaly. They were the beginning of a synchronization process that is still happening today. Every time you feel a sudden, unexplained chill, or every time you notice a digital clock skip a second, you are feeling the echo of the 400-second pulse. The monitor flicker dies out. The room returns to total darkness, illuminated only by the faint blue light of the absolute zero data logs. The file is ready to be closed, but the weight of the information makes it impossible to simply walk away. You are now part of the archive. Your heartbeat is now part of the frequency. The biological stasis of the passengers remains a harrowing testament to the power of the 1994 pulse. But as the medical teams worked to contain the physical symptoms, they missed a far more dangerous development occurring in the terminal's shadows. A single witness, a janitor who had been cleaning the holding area, reported seeing something that the cameras couldn't capture, a figure that didn't belong to any flight manifest, moving through the synchronized crowd with an impossible fluid grace. This hollow man was carrying a briefcase that emitted a low, rhythmic hum sound that seemed to control the heartbeats of everyone in the room. The true nature of the archive was about to be revealed, not through the passengers who survived, but through the one man who was never supposed to be on the plane in the first place, leading to a discovery that would change the very definition of a cover-up. In the quiet, dust-filled sub-basements of the Department of Transportation, there exists a document that effectively rewrites the history of American aviation. It is known simply as Classified Memo 94 Delta. This was the first internal briefing generated after the July 19th incident, a raw and terrifying distillation of the truth before the censors could fully scrub the record. The encrypted pages of this memo contained the first official admission of an anomaly so severe that it threatened the very integrity of the Midwestern airspace. Every line of technical data suggests that the sky wasn't just monitored, it was failing. According to the memo, the primary radar returns from 300 aircraft were not just lost, is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature designed to preserve paper that was never intended to be touched by human hands. As the heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and crumbling sterile paper fills the air. The folder for Memo 94 Delta is remarkably thin, yet it carries a weight that feels physical. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby terminal casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the first page. You can see where the ink has begun to fade, and where the heavy black lines of a redaction pen have attempted to bury the impossible. The paper is chilling to the touch, and as you turn the first page, a faint static seems to vibrate through the very desk. The memo was drafted at 5:45 a.m. on July 19, 1994. Less than 3 hours after the radar screens at O'Hare went flat. The author is listed only as Senior Analyst 09, a man whose identity was later purged from all government payroll records. This creates a sense of quiet dread. The memo does not begin with a greeting or a summary. It begins with a warning. The following data suggests a systemic failure of the atmospheric grid. It reads, "The tone is detached. academic, and utterly cold. It treats the disappearance of 300 aircraft not as a human tragedy, but as a data error in the architecture of the world. As we dive into the intellectual curiosity of the first section, we find the telemetry discrepancy report. The analyst notes that during the 400 seconds of the void, the HCS mainframe didn't just stop receiving data. It began to generate inverse coordinates. These were locations that existed outside the standard three-dimensional grid of the FAA's mapping software. The memo describes these as negative spaces, points in the sky where the math of the universe returned a value of 0. It suggests that the planes hadn't just moved, they had fallen into the gaps between the numbers. Reflection on the language used in the memo reveals a disturbing pattern. The author refuses to use words like plane, passenger, or pilot. Instead, the aircraft are referred to as vessels of interest, and the people on board are labeled as biological units in stasis. This dehumanization was the first step in the systemic erasure of the event. If the people weren't people, then their missing 400 seconds didn't matter. The memo focused exclusively on the 12-mile jump, calculating the energy required to move that mass without acceleration. The conclusion, scrawled in the margin, is simply, calculated energy, infinite. Source, unknown. The monitor flicker seems to intensify as we reach section B, the biological lag observations. This is where the academic tone begins to crack. The analyst describes the arrival of United Flight 702. He notes that when the doors were opened, the air that spilled out was not atmospheric. It was a pressurized gas that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The passengers were described as being in a state of perfect harmonic synchronization. Their heartbeats were not just similar, they were identical, timed to a rhythm that the analyst could not identify. This was the first mention of the 44.1 kHz frequency, the breathing of the void. The second half of Memo 94 Delta is a masterclass in the art of the hidden truth. Much of the text is obscured by heavy, black redaction marks, but the Archive Chill Collective has utilized advanced scanning techniques to recover the impressions left by the original typewriter. What lies beneath those black lines is far more terrifying than the visible text. Under the section titled Ground Crew Interrogations, there is a redacted passage concerning the loosening of the steel. The memo admits that 4 hours after the jump, the metal of the 3 affected aircraft remained in a quantum fluid state. A mechanic's hand could pass through the fuselage as if it were made of water. This wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a fundamental change in the molecular structure of the planes. The memo suggests that the 400-second pulse had unlocked the physical laws of the materials, leaving them in a state of probability rather than certainty. The faint static on the archive's audio files captures a recording of a briefing based on this memo. You can hear a senior official asking, if the steel is fluid, what happened to the passenger's bones? The silence that follows on the tape is heavy with intellectual dread. The memo answers this question in a later, heavily encrypted addendum. Skeletal density in 88% of subjects shows a latticework pattern consistent with non-Euclidean geometry. The memo is vibrating. The lag is permanent. This leads to the manifest discrepancy analysis. This is where Memo 94 Delta documents the 6 extra passengers who walked off the flights. In the visible text, they are listed as unaccounted individuals. But in the redacted findings, they are described as temporal echoes. The memo suggests that these were not new people, but versions of the existing passengers who had been displaced during the fold. One man on Flight 702 walked off the plane, only to see another version of himself being led away by BTI agents. This version had no eyes, only a surface of faint static where his pupils should have been. The cold air of the archive seems to freeze the very breath in your lungs. As you read the final section of the findings, it is titled the Terminal Echo Protocol. The memo recommends the immediate incineration of all clothing, luggage, and personal items from the 3 flights. It wasn't about cleaning a crime scene. It was about destroying infected time. The government feared that if a single watch that had stopped at 3:14 a.m. remained in the public, it would act as a chronological anchor, pulling the rest of the world into the same biological lag. As we reflect on the legacy of Memo 90, we realize that the hidden truth it contains was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be managed. The first redacted findings weren't a call to action, they were a blueprint for a cover-up that has lasted over 30 years. The erased data in the memo serves as the foundation for modern air traffic control system designed to smooth over the glitches so that we never notice when the world folds. The analyst who wrote the memo concluded his report with a terrifying hypothesis. He suggested that the 400-second pulse was not a fluke, but a reindexing of the world. He compared reality to a massive database that had become cluttered with too much information, too much life, too much movement. Every few decades, the system needs to delete a small portion of time to maintain its stability. July 19, 1994, was simply the moment the delete key was pressed over Chicago. This intellectual curiosity leads to a harrowing question. If the world reindexed in 1994, what has happened since? The archive chill has found references to Memo 22 Beta and Memo 25 Gamma, suggesting that these pulses are becoming more frequent. We are living in a world that is being constantly edited, and we are the data points that are being moved from one coordinate to another. Without our knowledge, the monitor flicker begins to slow, the pale blue light fading into the gray shadows of the server room. The file for Memo 94 Delta is ready to be closed, but the information it holds stays with you. It is a cold, academic weight. It is the realization that your own watch, your own heartbeat, and your own history are only as real as the next systemic update allows them to be. The analyst's final, handwritten note at the bottom of the last page remains the most haunting. We didn't bring everyone back. Some of them are still in the fold, and some of the things we brought back aren't people. The folder is heavy with the dust of 30 years. The ink is old, the paper is brittle, but the anomaly described within is still active. It is a silent rhythmic breathing that echoes through the halls of the archive, a reminder that the 12-mile jump was just the first step in a much longer journey into the void. The archival researcher must also look at the personnel logs attached to the memo. Every individual mentioned the controllers, the ground crew. The initial medical team was eventually phased out of their careers. The memo recommends a total cognitive reset for anyone who had prolonged contact with the agricultural samples in the cargo hold. This explains why the 1994 incident feels like a ghost story. It's because the people who could have told the truth were themselves erased. Their memories were treated like corrupted sectors on a hard drive, rewritten with a more acceptable, boring version of history. They remember a technical glitch. They remember a long night at the office. They don't remember the fluid steel, the extra passengers, or the biological lag. But the memo survives. It is the one piece of evidence that couldn't be fully destroyed because it was needed for the BTI's own internal records. It is a mirror of the world as it truly is. A collection of classified anomalies hidden behind a thin veil of bureaucratic normalcy. As you sit in the cold air, surrounded by the hum of the servers, you realize that the archive is the only place where time moves correctly. Outside, in the modern world, we are all living in a state of post-94 synchronization. We are all breathing in time with the 44.1 kHz hum, unaware that our reality was edited 30 years. Prove that continuity is a fragile illusion. We are only here because the encrypted logs say we are. We are only here because the system hasn't decided to move us 12 miles ahead yet. The intellectual dread of Memo 94 Delta is the ultimate sleep story for the modern age. It is the story of a world that is being managed by silent analysts in cold rooms. People who decide which parts of our history are kept and which are erased. It is the story of the absolute zero that waits for us in the gaps between the radar sweeps. The monitor flicker finally dies out. The archive returns to total darkness, the only light coming from the faint, blue luminescence of the documents themselves. The folder is closed, the steel drawer is locked, and the secrets of 3:14 a.m. are returned to the silence of the sub-basement. But the frequency remains, the breathing remains, and the hidden truth is now a part of your own internal archive. The internal memos of the Department of Transportation provide a chilling framework for the O'Hare incident, but even the most senior analysts were unprepared for what was discovered during the physical inspection of the 3 aircraft. While the paperwork focused on the how, the ground crew at Gate B12 stumbled upon the what, a series of physical markings on the interior of the planes that weren't made by tools or human hands. These were geometric etches that seemed to have been burned into the plastic and fabric of the cabin from the inside out, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent light that defied every known law of biology. As the first witness reached out to touch one of these glowing symbols, the entire terminal experienced a secondary pulse, revealing that the archive wasn't just a record of the past, but a living, breathing entity that had already claimed its next victim. While the radar rooms at O'Hare were spiraling into a digital panic, the physical reality of the July 19th incident was manifesting at Gate B12. In the world of classified intelligence, we often focus on the numbers, the 400 seconds, the 12-mile jump, the encrypted telemetry. But for the single witness standing at the jet bridge that morning, The truth wasn't mathematical, it was biological. Sarah Jensen, a gate agent whose existence was later erased from airport personnel records, stood frozen as the cabin door of United Flight 702 finally swung open. She expected to see tired travelers. Instead, she encountered a terrifying anomaly. As the 300 passengers disembarked, Sarah noted a detail that would haunt the few remaining unseen history archives. They didn't have shadows. Their eyes didn't reflect the terminal lights, but instead seemed to swallow them. This hidden truth suggests that the static window didn't just move the planes, it hollowed out the souls of everyone on board. The file documenting Jensen's testimony was buried under a code black clearance, hidden from the public for over 30 years. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that settles deep in the chest, echoing the heartbeat of a world that is slightly out of sync. The cold air is kept at a constant 55 degrees. A biting temperature designed to preserve the integrity of the fragile, redacted folders. As the heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and old sterile paper fills the room. The folder for Sarah Jensen's witness statement is thinner than the technical logs, yet it feels more dangerous. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby workstation casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the first page. You can see the heavy black redaction lines where the Bureau of Temporal Integrity tried to silence her. The ink has faded, but the faint static vibrating through the desk tells you that the memory of Gate B12 is still active. The morning of July 19th was humid, even inside the air-conditioned terminal, but as Flight 702 pulled into Gate B12, Sarah Jensen reported a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't just a draft. It was a localized collapse of thermal energy. In her classified testimony, she describes the jet bridge as feeling metallic and thin, as if the walls were no longer made of steel and carpet, but of something far less substantial. This creates a sense of quiet dread as we realize that the plane had brought the environment of the void with it. Intellectual curiosity leads us to examine her description of the cabin door. When it opened, there was no sound of rushing air or pressurized hiss. There was only a silence so absolute that Sarah could hear the internal clicking of her own mechanical watch. A watch that, unknown to her, had already stopped at 3:14 a.m. She noted that the interior of the plane looked pixelated. Colors of the seats and the carpet seemed to be vibrating at a frequency her eyes couldn't quite process. Reflection on the first passenger to disembark, a businessman in a gray suit, reveals the core of the horror. Sarah reached out to take his ticket, a standard procedure even in the chaos of a technical delay. But as he passed her, she realized he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point 10 miles behind her. She described them as being full of gray static. Most disturbingly, as he stepped under the high-intensity halogen lights of the terminal, he cast no shadow on the floor. He was a three-dimensional object that didn't occupy space in the way a human should. He looked, in her words, completely hollow. The monitor flicker in the archive pulses as we read further into her description of the crowd. All 300 passengers moved with a synchronized, fluid grace. They didn't stumble. They didn't look for their gate. They simply walked in a perfect rhythmic line. They moved in time with a sound that only they could hear, a low-frequency breathing that Sarah felt in her teeth. This was the first physical evidence of the harmonic core, the biological synchronization that had merged 300 individuals into a single, hollow entity. After the passengers had been led away by the men in charcoal suits, Sarah Jensen did something she wasn't supposed to do. She stepped onto the plane. The encrypted logs of her interrogation reveal what she saw inside the cabin of Flight 702. The interior was no longer the plane she knew. The plastic panels of the walls were covered in geometric etches, tiny, intricate patterns that appeared to have been burned into the material from the inside out. These symbols were not letters or numbers. They were complex, non-Euclidean shapes that seemed to pulse with a faint, bioluminescent light. As Sarah moved down the aisle, she noticed that the light from the terminal didn't seem to reach the back of the plane. The further she went, the more the environment felt like it was losing resolution. The edges of the seats were blurry, and the faint static in the air grew so loud it sounded like a scream. The analytical report attached to Jensen's file suggests that these markings were spatial anchors. The plane hadn't just jumped 12 miles, it had been tagged by the coordinates it had visited. The cabin was a recording of the void, and the etches were the data points. Sarah reported that when she touched one of the glowing symbols on the headrest of seat 14B, her hand didn't feel the plastic. She felt a cold, vibrating hum that traveled up her arm and settled in her marrow. This leads us to the hidden truth of the Hollow Man. As Sarah reached the mid-cabin galley, she saw a figure that did not belong on the manifest. He was taller than a normal man, dressed in a uniform that matched the flight crew's, but his face was a featureless surface of gray luminescence. He was standing perfectly still, holding a briefcase that emitted the 44.1 kHz frequency. Sarah noted that the air around him seemed to warp, as if the gravity in his immediate vicinity was 10 times stronger than the rest of the plane. This was the unseen passenger, the architect of the 400-second pulse. The Bureau of Temporal Integrity, BTI, moved in within minutes of Sarah exiting the plane. The cold air of the archive room reflects the clinical coldness of their methods. Sarah was taken to a sub-basement room in Terminal 5, a room that doesn't appear on any architectural blueprints. There, she was subjected to 48 hours of cognitive recalibration. The classified logs of her session show that the BTI agents weren't interested in what she saw. They were interested in how much of the static she had absorbed. They used a series of flashing lights and low-frequency tones to disrupt her memory of Gate B12. They wanted to ensure that when she looked back at that morning, she only remembered a routine delay and a technical glitch. But Sarah Jensen was a high-retention subject. Her brain refused to let go of the image of the hollow passengers. In her final recorded interview, she tells the agent, "You can take my job, and you can take my name, but you can't fill the hole they left in the terminal. The air is still empty there. It's always going to be empty." This reflection on the nature of memory is the most haunting part of the file. It suggests that once you have seen the absolute zero of reality, you can never truly return to the illusion. Sarah was eventually given a new identity and moved to a small town in Oregon, but the unseen history researcher discovered that her medical records from the 2000s mention a strange symptom. She could no longer see her own reflection in mirrors. To her eyes, she had cold, steel jaw, a reminder that the truth has a way of lingering in the margins. The archive includes a technical addendum to Jensen's testimony. Written by a physicist affiliated with the BTI, it attempts to explain the hollow appearance of the passengers through the lens of molecular density. The report suggests that during the 400-second pulse, the passengers' bodies underwent a dimensional thinning. In our standard reality, human matter is dense and occupies a specific volume of space, but the passengers had been stretched across the 12-mile jump. Their atoms were still technically there, but the distance between the atoms had been increased by a factor of 10,000. They were like a high-resolution image that had been stretched until the pixels became visible. This is why they looked too clear and yet hollow at the same time. They were losing their three-dimensional integrity. The lack of shadows is explained by light transmittance anomaly. Because their molecular structure was so thinned out, photons from the terminal light simply passed through their bodies without being absorbed or reflected. They were physically present, but optically transparent. They were ghosts of matter, living records of a spatial discontinuity that the world was not meant to witness. The monitor flicker cast over this report highlights the chilling conclusion. The subjects are no longer compatible with the Earth's gravitational constant. They are in a state of permanent fall. This suggests that the hollow passengers weren't just walking. They were falling through our reality at a rate that we simply couldn't perceive. Their synchronization was a survival mechanism, a way to anchor themselves to each other, so they didn't drift away into the void. The cold air in the archive seems to hum as you process this data. You realize that Gate B12 wasn't just a gate, it was a transition point between two versions of the universe. One version where time moves forward, and another where time is a hollow, gray static. As we reach the final sections of the Jensen file, the intellectual curiosity shifts to the terminal itself. Even though Gate B12 was rebuilt, and the geometric etches were scrubbed away with industrial solvents, the anomaly remains. Airport staff at O'Hare still report a cold spot at that specific coordinate. Electrical equipment frequently fails in the vicinity of the gate, and several people have reported seeing gray ribbons in the air during the early morning hours of July 19th. The hidden truth is that Sarah Jensen was right. The air at Gate B12 is still empty. The 400-second pulse left a permanent scar on the architecture of the terminal. It is a place where the resolution of the world is slightly lower than everywhere else. The Archive Chill Collective has documented several other witnesses who were present that morning: baggage handlers, security guards. Their stories all echo Sarah's. They all speak of the hollow look, the rhythmic breathing, and the sensation of the world becoming thin, but Sarah's testimony is the only one that captures the hollow man in the galley. Figure who didn't belong. This reflection leads us to a disturbing possibility. If there was one unseen passenger on Flight 702, were there others on the other flights? And where are they now? The archive suggests they never left the airport. They simply moved into the negative spaces of the terminal, the areas between the walls and the ceilings where the radar cannot reach. The monitor flicker slows as the server room prepares for a data backup cycle. The pale blue light dims, leaving the folder in shadow. You realize that the quiet dread of Gate B12 is not just a story from 1994, it is a warning about the fragility of the human form. We are only as solid as the time we inhabit. If that time is taken away, we become hollow. The last page of Sarah Jensen's file contains a single, unredacted photograph. It is a grainy, low-resolution shot of the jet bridge at Gate B12. Taken by a security camera at 4:15 a.m. In the photo, you can see the businessman in the grey suit disembarking. But if you look closely at the floor beneath his feet, you see something that the BTI missed. There is no shadow, but there is a faint, glowing geometric shape on the carpet, a perfect replica of the etches found inside the plane. The passenger wasn't just moving, he was printing the void onto our world with every step he took. This intellectual dread is the true legacy of the July 19th incident. The biological lag and the 12-mile jump were just the symptoms. The hollow passengers were the carriers. They were the ones who brought the absolute zero into the heart of Chicago. And from there it has spread. The cold air of the archive room is now still. The hum of the servers is the only voice left. We have documented the witness, the hollow passengers, and the geometric etches. We have looked behind the curtain of the BTI's erasure. But the folder is not truly closed. The data is still vibrating. The hollow man is still standing in the galley of a plane that no longer exists. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of Gate B12. It is the sound of a sky that is still missing 400 seconds. It is the sound of a truth that is waiting to be remembered. Sarah Jensen's testimony at Gate B12 provides a harrowing look at the physical transformation of the passengers, but even her detailed account missed the most terrifying aspect of the hollow phenomenon. As the BTI agents were processing the survivors, they noticed a pattern in the electronic signals being emitted from the passengers' own skin, a signal that wasn't coming from their nervous systems, but from a source outside our planetary frequency. This signal from the bone was broadcasting a set of coordinates that didn't point to any location on Earth. Instead, it was a homing beacon for something currently moving through the high-altitude corridors of the Midwestern sky, something that had been activated by the 400-second pulse and was now descending toward city of Chicago with a cold, predatory intent. The true nature of the project was about to be revealed, and it had nothing to do with aviation, and everything to do with the invisible patch that the government was desperately trying to hide from the sun. In the immediate wake of the 1994 O'Hare incident, the United States government was forced to confront a reality that no amount of standard censorship could contain. They hadn't just witnessed a technical anomaly, they had identified a fundamental flaw in the fabric of the planetary atmosphere. The classified truth was that the 400-second pulse wasn't a one-time event. It was a recurring systemic stutter. To prevent the public from ever seeing the sky go flat again, a multi-agency task force initiated Project Static Sky. This was the birth of the invisible patch, a deeply encrypted software integration into every radar and GPS mainframe in the Western world. Its purpose was simple yet terrifying: to identify a spatial jump in real time and immediately fill the gap with erased and reconstructed data. For 30 years, this file has documented how the government effectively smeared our perception of reality. To hide the fact that planes are still disappearing, this hidden truth suggests that the sky you see on a flight tracker is not a live broadcast, but a carefully edited simulation designed to mask the void. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the breathing of a digital god. The cold air is kept at a constant 55 degrees. A biting temperature that keeps the massive mainframes from overheating as they process millions of miles of sky. As the heavy steel drawer of the secure archive slides open, the scent of ozone and fading, sterile ink fills the space. The folder for Project Static Sky is bound in a gray, metallic material, its pages crisp and cold to the touch. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby diagnostic terminal casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the table, highlighting the complex algorithmic charts that define our modern horizon. You can feel the faint static of 30 years of suppressed data vibrating through the paper, a record of a world that is being constantly patched to keep the illusion of continuity alive. Following the 12-mile jump, the Department of Defense realized that traditional radar was too honest. It reported exactly what it saw: planes vanishing and reappearing at impossible coordinates. Project Static Sky was designed to fix this honesty. The project was a collaboration between the NSA's cryptographic wing and the FAA's technical engineers. They developed what is known as the linearity buffer, a piece of code that sits between the raw radar feed and the controller's screen. This created a sense of quiet dread among the initial programmers, who realized they were being asked to build a machine that would lie to the world on a permanent, global scale. The intellectual curiosity behind the invisible patch lies in its mathematical elegance. When a plane experiences a 400-second pulse and jumps in space, the buffer detects the absolute zero data point. Instead of showing a blank screen or a jumping icon, the patch instantly generates a phantom path. It uses the plane's last known speed and heading to draw a fake icon that moves smoothly across the screen, while the real milliseconds. Reflection on this system reveals the sheer scale of the deception. It means that every commercial flight you take is potentially being patched in real. If your plane enters a static window, you wouldn't know, and your pilot wouldn't know. The GPS on the flight deck is slave to the same encrypted correction algorithms. If the plane jumps, the GPS simply recalculates the position and adjusts the digital map to match the static sky reality. The cold air in the archive feels even more clinical as you realize that the government has effectively placed a digital veil over the entire planet. We are no longer watching the sky. We are watching a highly processed, safe version of the sky that the Bureau of Temporal Integrity (BTI) has approved for public consumption. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, Project Static Sky grew from a localized O'Hare fix into a global standard. This was achieved through the transition to next-gen air traffic control. Every time the FAA announced a modernization of its radar systems, the hidden truth was that they were installing deeper layers of the invisible patch. The transition from primary radar, which bounces physical waves off metal, to a DSB, which relies on satellite-linked data, was the final master. A DSB is entirely software-dependent, making it infinitely easier for the erased segments of a flight to be hidden behind a wall of code. A faint static pop on a recorded briefing from 2004 confirms that by that year, the absolute zero anomaly was being successfully masked in 99% of North American airspace. The technical density of this modernization is staggering. The archive contains the source code for the spline interpolation module, the specific part of the patch that handles the 12-mile jumps. It doesn't just move the icon, it adjusts the timestamps of the entire regional network. If one plane jumps, the system slightly slows down the icons of every other plane in the sector to ensure that the relative distances remain constant. It is a massive, planetary-scale game of hide-and-seek, where the system is constantly adjusting the time and space of every flying object to hide a single, recurring anomaly. The monitor flicker from the archive's code viewer reveals that the patch now consumes more processing power than the actual flight tracking itself. This leads to the intellectual dread of the data ghost. When the invisible patch is active, it creates a duplicate set of data. There is the real sky, the sky full of jumps, pulses, and voids, and the static sky, the smooth, predictable one we see. The classified files show that the government keeps both records. In a high-security facility in Utah, there are servers that contain the unprocessed truth of every flight since 1994. These servers are disconnected from the internet, accessible only to those with static sky clearance. The cold air of the archive seems to hum with the knowledge that there is a parallel history of aviation that the public will never see. History where thousands of planes have occupied coordinates that don't exist on any map. However, no patch is perfect. Project Static Sky has suffered what the archive calls rendering failures. These occur when a spatial jump is so large or a pulse is so long that the algorithm cannot smooth the data fast enough. This is when the hidden truth leaks into the public eye. You may have seen these moments on consumer flight tracking apps: a plane that suddenly teleports across a state, or an icon that flies at 3,000 miles per hour for a split second before snapping back. A faint static vibration in the room occurs as you read about the 2012 Denver blur, where a total system failure of the invisible patch caused 42 planes to disappear from civilian radar for a full minute, only to reappear in a tangled mess of icons that took hours to reconcile. The BTI's response to these leaks is always the same: a minor software glitch, a server lag, an internet connectivity issue. But the encrypted logs tell a different story. These aren't glitches in the app, they are glitches in the cover-up. They are the moments when the absolute zero void is too massive for the government's digital veil to hide. Reflection on these failures reveals a terrifying pattern. The pulses are becoming more frequent, and the jumps are becoming longer. The invisible patch is being stretched to its breaking point. In the cold air of the archive, you find a memo from 2022 stating that the current version of the static sky software is struggling to maintain the illusion of continuity in the Pacific corridor. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the shadow, cites the physical locations. On Earth, where the invisible patch is most active, these are not airport towers, but massive, unmarked satellite arrays in the middle of deserts and oceans. These arrays don't track planes, they broadcast the patch. They project a localized electromagnetic field that calibrates the atmosphere to be more receptive to the digital correction. The monitor flicker from the archives. Satellite map shows that these sites are perfectly aligned with the ghost coordinates identified in 1994. The government isn't just patching the software, they are trying to patch the sky itself. The most harrowing aspect of Project Static Sky is what it does to the people inside the patch. While the software hides the jump from the ground, it cannot hide the jump from the human body. The biological lag mentioned in previous files is exacerbated by the invisible patch, because the system smears the time and space of a flight to make it look smooth. The passengers' bodies are forced to endure a chronological stretching that classified medical appendix of the project describes temporal nausea, a condition found in frequent flyers and long-haul pilots. It is caused by the body's internal clock attempting to reconcile the real sky with the static sky. Your cells know they just jumped 12 miles in a second, but your eyes and your watch, corrected by the patch, tell you that everything is normal. This creates a deep subconscious anomaly in the human nervous system. A faint static hum on the archive's audio recordings captures a pilot, describing the feeling as having a soul that is 3 seconds behind your body. This reflection on the biological cost leads to the manifest erasure protocol. The BTI has found that people who spend too much time in the patched sky begin to exhibit the same hollow characteristics as the 1994 survivors. Their molecular density begins to decrease. They become untethered. The government's solution is not to fix the problem, but to patch the people. Project Static Sky includes a sub-project that uses low-frequency infrasound broadcast through airplane cabin speakers ostensibly for noise cancellation to keep passengers in a state of mild cognitive dissociation. This ensures that even if a passenger notices a glitch, their brain will immediately erase the memory or dismiss it as a dream. The cold air of the archive feels heavy with the weight of this realization. You are not just being lied to about where your plane is. You are being biologically manipulated to ensure you never ask. The invisible patch is a total system of control, a digital and psychological cage that surrounds the planet. The monitor flicker cast over the passenger control documents shows that the infrasound frequency is unsurprisingly set to a harmonic of 44.1 kHz. The breathing of the void is being used to keep us asleep. As we reach the final pages of the Project Static Sky file, the tone becomes one of grim academic resignation. The analysts who maintain the archive know that the invisible patch is a temporary solution. You cannot hide the truth of the universe with code forever. The absolute zero pulse is a natural function of a reality that is trying to re-index, and the government's attempts to stop it are only making the eventual collapse more violent. The intellectual dread stems from the cascading failure scenario described in the 2025 Outlook. The memo warns that if the invisible patch ever fails completely due to a solar flare or a massive spatial pulse, the sudden re-entry of 30 years of suppressed data would be catastrophic. Every plane in the sky would suddenly jump to its real coordinates at once. The timestamps of every computer system on Earth would The world would see, for the first time since 1994, the sky as it truly is. A broken, flickering canvas of erased time and hidden truths. The faint static in the archive room grows louder, as if the room itself is struggling to stay patched. You realize that the archive is the only place where the static sky hasn't reached. Here the data is raw, cold, and terrifying. Outside, people are looking at their flight apps, seeing smooth, predictable lines, and feeling a false sense of security. They are living in the invisible patch, unaware that their reality is a 12-millisecond simulation. The monitor flicker slows to a crawl, the pale blue light barely illuminating the final, unredacted warning in the folder. The sky is not a ceiling, it is a screen, and the screen is beginning to crack. This reflection on the fragility of our horizon is the true archive chill. It is the realization that we are flying through a digital lie, held up by ancient mainframes and encrypted Cockpit at 30,000 feet thin, pressurized, and artificial. The hum of the servers is the only voice left. A constant reminder that the system is still running, still patching, still lying. The archive is a record of a war between the truth of the universe and the bureaucracy of the state. And for now, the bureaucracy is winning. The monitor flicker finally dies out, leaving the server room in total shadow. The heavy steel drawer is ready to be locked, and the secrets of Project Static Sky are returned to the darkness. But the information density of this file remains in your mind. Every time you look at a radar map or a GPS screen, you will look for the smear. You will look for the 12-millisecond correction. You will look for the anomaly that the government spent 30 years trying to erase. The file is heavy. The ink is old, but the algorithm is still active. The sky is being patched as we speak, and the void is still breathing on the other side of the screen. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of the world's source code being rewritten. It is the sound of a static sky that is no longer static. It is the sound of a hidden truth that is ready to be revealed. Project Static Sky has successfully hidden the physical jumps of our aircraft for decades, but the government's digital veil was never designed to account for what happens when the real sky and the static sky begin to overlap in the human mind. A series of leaked psychiatric reports from the FAA's High-Altitude Training Center has revealed a terrifying new phenomenon. Pilots are beginning to report ghost vision, the ability to see both versions of the sky at once. One veteran captain describes seeing his co-pilot become a translucent, vibrating mass of gray static while the flight deck instruments insisted everything was normal. This temporal drift is not a software error, but a biological rejection of the invisible patch, and as the number of affected pilots grows, the government has been forced to initiate a total system purge of anyone who has looked too closely at the horizon. The true cost of the patch is finally being paid, not in data, but in the sanity of the men and women we trust to keep us in the air, leading to a desperate, last-minute experiment that aims to anchor our reality to a source that should never have been touched. Then the hidden corridors of the 1994 O'Hare investigation. There is a specific set of medical files that the Bureau of Temporal Integrity considers their greatest failure. It describes a phenomenon known as the temporal drift, a horrifying biological anomaly where the human body and the human consciousness were ripped apart during the 400-second pulse. While the aircraft were physically jumping 12 miles across the Illinois sky, the minds of the 3,000 passengers remained terrifyingly frozen at exactly 3:14 a.m. This was not a coma, and it was not sleep. It was a state of quantum decay. The classified IG recordings from that morning prove a hidden truth that modern neuroscience refuses to acknowledge. It is possible for a body to walk, breathe, and speak while the mind is still trapped in a moment that has already passed. These erased records document a world where the physical self is merely a ghost, moving through a reality that the consciousness can no longer perceive. The encrypted logs of the frozen minds reveal that for many, the drift never ended. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy, cold blanket. The cold air in this sub-basement is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature designed to preserve the integrity of the fragile redacted folders. As the heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and old sterile paper fills the air. The folder for the temporal drift is bound in a pale blue material, its pages crisp and chilling to the touch. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby diagnostic terminal casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the table, highlighting the jagged, impossible brainwave charts of the survivors. You can feel the faint static of 30 years of suppressed trauma vibrating through the paper, a record of 3,000 souls who were left behind by their own bodies. To understand the temporal drift, one must first understand the relationship between time and the human brain. Our consciousness functions as a continuous streamer serial processing of reality that allows us to perceive a now. But at 3:14 a.m., that stream was severed. In the classified medical appendix of the O'Hare report, Dr. Eris Thorne noted that while the passengers' bodies showed standard vital signs upon landing, their brain activity was static. This creates a sense of quiet dread as we realize that the people disembarking the planes were essentially biological automatons. Their neurons were firing. But there was no observer behind the eyes. The intellectual curiosity of the BTI Bureau of Temporal Integrity focused on the EEG readings taken in the terminal holding areas. A standard human brain at rest produces alpha and beta waves, but the survivors of Flight 702 produced something else, a flat, horizontal line that was occasionally interrupted by a single, massive spike of energy every 400 seconds. A faint monitor flicker in the archive room highlights these spikes, which analysts believe were the mind's desperate attempts to catch up to the body's new coordinates. The brain was stuck in a loop, reprocessing the exact millisecond the pulse began, while the body was already miles away, walking through a jet bridge. Reflection on this state reveals a harrowing paradox. If the mind is frozen at 3:14 a.m., but the body is moving at 4:30 a.m., what is controlling the body? The encrypted logs suggest that the absolute zero pulse didn't just stop the mind. It replaced the individual consciousness with a systemic pilot. During the 400 seconds of the void, the passengers were no longer autonomous beings. They were being moved by the same frequency that moved the planes, the 44.1 kHz breathing of the void. The cold air of the archive feels even more clinical as you realize that for a brief moment, 3,000 Americans were physically operated by an external, non-human data stream. The most documented case of temporal drift involves a passenger named Elias Thorne, coincidentally sharing a name with the pilot, though no relation was found. Elias was a 30-year-old architect who, according to his wife, was never the same after the July 19th flight. The hidden truth hidden in his private medical file reveals that Elias was living in two timelines simultaneously. He could see his wife standing in front of him in their Chicago apartment, but he could also still see the interior of Flight 702 at 3:14 a.m. A faint static hum on the archive's audio recordings captures him describing the sensation. "I am sitting at the dinner table, but I can still feel the cold glass of the airplane window against my forehead. I can hear my wife talking, but her voice is buried under the sound of 1,000 engines." This is the ghost vision mentioned in the Project Static Sky files. It is the result of the brain's inability to fully re-anchor to the physical body. Because the body moved 12 miles in a second, the sensory data of the jump was too massive for the brain to process. The mind simply stayed behind, anchored to the last stable coordinate it knew. This led to a state of permanent desynchronization. Elias reported that he would see a cup of coffee fall and shatter on the floor, but he wouldn't hear the sound of the glass breaking until exactly 400 seconds later. His auditory cortex was drifting 400 seconds behind his visual cortex. The technical density of this condition is explored in the BTI's cognitive sync report. They found that the drift was not just a mental issue, but a physical one. The monitor flicker cast over the neurological scans shows that the time delay was actually visible in the blood flow of the brain. The blood was reaching the frontal lobe 400 seconds later than it should have. This suggests that the static window had created a permanent, localized time dilation inside the passengers' skulls. They were living biological records of the 1994 anomaly, carrying a piece of the 3:14 a.m. sky with them wherever they went. Reflection on the social cost of the temporal drift is equally devastating. The erased personnel files of the airline show that many flight attendants who survived the jump became stuck in a state of catatonic reflection. They would stand in the middle of a crowded terminal and suddenly stop moving. Their eyes glazed over as if they were listening to a distant radio station. The BTI analysts realized that these stalls were the moments when the drift became too strong, and the mind was pulled back into the void entirely. For those few seconds, the body became a hollow shell again, waiting for the mind to return from 3:14 a.m. The cold air of the archive seems to hum with the tragedy of these lost moments. One of the most unsettling sensory details recorded in the Frozen Minds file is the sensation of phantom, where survivors reported that they felt as if their limbs were incredibly heavy, as if they were constantly dragging an invisible anchor behind them. The drift would snap, causing a total molecular collapse. This is why the survivors were discouraged from traveling and were often kept in stabilization zones near the Midwest. They were physically tethered to the 3:14 a.m. coordinate. If they moved to California or Europe, the distance between their mind and their body would become so great that the temporal drift would effectively tear them in half. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the mirror anomaly. Several survivors reported that they could no longer recognize themselves in mirrors. It wasn't that their face had changed. It was that the reflection was moving too fast. When they blinked, the reflection in the mirror wouldn't blink until a fraction of a second later. The monitor flicker in the archive room reflects this jagged reality. The mirror was showing them their physical body, which was in the present, while their brain was perceiving the reflection through the lens of the 400-second delay. They were strangers to their own reflections, haunted by a body that was moving without them. The cold air of the archive feels heavy with this realization. The absolute zero pulse didn't just move planes. It created a new class of human being, the drifters, people who were physically present but chronologically absent. The government's invisible patch was designed to hide the planes, but it couldn't hide the drifters. They were the living glitches in the system, the ones who could see the real sky through the gaps in the digital veil. The encrypted logs show that the BTI eventually initiated a total quarantine of the drifters, moving them to unmarked facilities where their frozen minds could be studied in total isolation. In the late 1990s, the BTI attempted a desperate experiment to resync the survivors of Flight 702. They believed that if they could expose the drifters to another 400-second pulse, it would snap their minds back into their bodies. This project, known as Project Anchor, involved taking 12 survivors back to the exact coordinates of the 1994 jump at exactly 3:14 a.m. The classified logs of Project Anchor are almost entirely redacted, but the Archive Chill Collective has recovered the audio from the observation deck. You can hear the low-frequency hum of the pulse generator, a sound that mimics the breathing of the void. As the pulse hit, the 12 survivors didn't resync. Instead, they collapsed into a single point of gray static. The monitor flicker on the Archive's video records shows the 12 bodies merging into a translucent mass that vibrated at 44.1 kHz before vanishing entirely. Hidden truth is that, once the mind has been drifted, it can never be returned. The brain has been recalibrated to a different frequency of existence. The experiment proved that the temporal drift wasn't a temporary side effect, it was an evolutionary editing of the human species. The survivors were no longer compatible with linear time. They were the first inhabitants of a static reality. The cold air in the archive feels like it is vibrating with the echoes of that failed experiment. You realize that the quiet dread of the drifters is the ultimate warning for the modern age. As we move faster and our technology becomes more instant, we are increasing the risk of a global temporal drift. We are moving our bodies at the speed of light, while our minds are still struggling to process the data of a second ago. We are all, in a sense, drifting. As we reach the final pages of the temporal drift file, the tone becomes one of grim academic resignation. The analysts who maintain the archive know that the mind's frozen phenomenon is the most dangerous secret of the O'Hare incident. It is the proof that our consciousness is not as secure as we believe. It is a fragile data stream that can be interrupted, edited, and erased by a single pulse from the void. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that many of the people we see every day might be the erased personnel logs of major corporations and government agencies show a high concentration of individuals who exhibit slight latency in their reactions, people who take just a fraction of a second too long to answer a question, or whose eyes seem to be focused on a point slightly behind your head. These are the ones who are edited by the static window, the ones whose minds are still trapped at 3:14 a.m. The faint static in the archive room grows louder, as if the room itself is trying to pull your mind back to the year 1994. You realize that the archive is a stabilization zone. Here, the time is fixed. The documents are frozen, but outside, the drift is accelerating. The government's Project Static Sky is barely holding the illusion of continuity together. The sky is jumping, the bodies are moving, and the minds are beginning to freeze. The monitor flicker slows to a crawl, the pale blue light barely illuminating the final, unredacted warning in the folder. The body is a vessel, the mind is an anchor, and the anchor has been cut. This reflection on the nature of identity is the true archive chill. It is the realization that you might not be the one reading these words. Your body might be sitting in a chair, but your mind might still be back at the last coordinate where your reality made sense. You might be drifting, and you would never even know that as the folder for Subtitle 8 is prepared for closure. The sense of quiet dread is absolute. We have documented the neurology of the void, the tragedy of Elias Thorne, and the failure of Project Anchor. We have seen how the temporal drift has created a world of hollow shells and frozen minds. The cold air of the room feels like the atmosphere of a cryogenics lab, sterile, biting, and silent. The hum of the servers is the only voice left, a constant reminder that the data is still being processed, even if the minds are not. The archive is a record of a tragedy that is still unfolding. It is a record of 3,000 people who are still, at this very moment, sitting in their seats on Flight 702, waiting for the radar to return. The monitor flicker finally dies out, leaving the server room in total shadow. The heavy steel drawer is ready to be locked, and the secrets of the temporal drift are returned to the darkness. But the information density of this file remains in your mind. Every time you feel a sudden déjà vu, or every time you notice someone staring into space with hollow eyes, you will think of the drift. you will think of the 400-second gap in their existence. The file is heavy, the ink is old, but the drift is still active, the minds are still frozen, and the body is still moving toward a destination it can no longer understand. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of your own mind trying to catch up. It is the sound of a 3:14 a.m. heartbeat that is still echoing through the Midwestern sky. It is a hidden truth that has finally found its way to you. The biological and neurological fallout of the 1994 jump has left a permanent scar on the survivors, but as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity worked to contain the drift, they realized that the anomaly wasn't just affecting the people, it was affecting the tools they used to measure reality. A senior technician at the O'Hare maintenance facility discovered something far more disturbing than a frozen mind. A set of maintenance logs for the planes themselves that had begun to rewrite their own history in real time. These living records were documenting repairs that hadn't happened yet, and describing parts of the aircraft that didn't exist in our physical dimension. As the technician reached out to touch the monitor, he felt a sudden, sharp vibration that resonated in his very DNA, revealing that the archive wasn't just a collection of files, but a living entity that was now preparing to reset the entire facility. The true source of the pulse was finally coming into focus, and it was a name that had been erased from every history book since the turn of the century, leading to a desperate race to shut down the mainframe before the final, permanent redaction began. Deep within the structural blueprints of O'Hare's terminal radar approach control, there exists a maintenance sublevel that has been officially decommissioned since August of 1994. It was here, amidst the cooling fans and the early silicon mainframes, that a systems engineer named Arthur Vane recorded the most terrifying first-hand account of the July 19th incident. His final entry, salvaged from a corrupted digital drive, is a classified testament to a reality that collapsed in real time. Vane didn't just watch the radar go flat, he felt the physical atmosphere of the room undergo a molecular transformation. According to his encrypted log, at the moment of the 400-second pulse, the oxygen around him reached a state of kinetic stasis. The hidden truth is that Vane survived the blackout, but he was never able to return to a world of fluid motion. His erased testimony describes a sensation that defies every known law of physics. The moment the very air felt like glass. This file contains the only known record of what happens to the human senses when the absolute zero of the void touches the physical world. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the archive is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the slow, heavy breathing of an ancient machine. The cold air is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature that keeps the redacted folders from decaying, though the paper already feels brittle. Monitor flicker from a nearby diagnostic terminal pulses across the first page, highlighting the jagged, desperate lines of a man who was losing his grip on a liquid reality. You can feel a faint static vibrating through the desk, as if the log itself is still broadcasting a frequency from 1994. Arthur Vane was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a systems engineer, a person who lived in the world of volts, cycles, and binary logic. On the morning of July 19th, he was stationed in the Level 4 server vault, a reinforced bunker designed to keep the HCS mainframes running during a total civil collapse. He was performing a routine diagnostic on the timing buffers when the pulse hit. In his log, he describes the exact moment, 3 hours, 14 minutes and 2 seconds AM, not as a loss of power, but as a loss of vibration. He noted that the constant, comforting hum of the cooling fans didn't stop, it simply became silent. This creates a sense of quiet dread as we realize that the sound was still there, but the air was no longer capable of carrying the waves. Vane's intellectual curiosity led him to stand up from his terminal to check the hardware racks, but as he moved, he realized that the air in the vault had changed its physical properties. It wasn't that the air was gone, it was that it had become rigid. In his log, he writes, "I tried to step forward, but the atmosphere resisted me. It felt like walking through a wall of cold, invisible glass. Every movement required a massive, conscious effort of will." A monitor flicker cast over his handwritten notes shows where he tried to calculate the density of the air, only to find that his pen would no longer leave a mark on the paper. The ink was frozen in the nib, not by cold, but by the absence of motion. Reflection on this state reveals a harrowing biological paradox. If the air was like glass, how was Vane able to breathe? He describes the sensation of inhaling as drawing shards of cold light into his lungs. Every breath was a mechanical struggle against an atmosphere that refused to be displaced. The cold air of the archive room seems to echo this struggle as you read his description of the static window. Vane realized that he wasn't just in a blackout. He was inside the source code of the anomaly. He was the only observer present in the very center of the 400-second pulse. The technical density of his log increases as he describes the appearance of the server racks. The LED lights on the panels, usually flickering with a frantic, digital energy, were now frozen in a state of mid-illumination. They weren't on, and they weren't off. They were holding a single, constant glow that didn't cast a shadow. A faint static hum began to resonate in Vane's teeth. The 44.1 kHz frequency that we have seen in every other redacted file from the O'Hare incident. Vane realized that the sound wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from the air itself. The glass was vibrating. As the second minute of the void began, Vane reported that his vision began to fracture, because the air had become rigid. The light passing through the room was being refracted as if it were passing through a cut diamond. He saw multiple versions of his own hands, multiple versions of the server racks, all layered on top of one another in a chaotic, translucent stack. This is the first mention of the spatial overlap that would later be documented in the classified ghost coordinate files. Vane was witnessing the sky being compressed from the inside out. Intellectual curiosity led him to touch one of the glass air pockets. He described the texture as impossibly smooth and bitingly cold. When he applied pressure, the air didn't move, it cracked. He heard a sound like a thin sheet of ice shattering, but there were no physical pieces on the floor. The crack was a visual anomaly, a jagged line in the air that stayed there for the duration of the pulse. This suggests that the static window had turned the atmosphere into a recordable medium. Every movement Vane made was leaving a permanent scar on the spacetime of the room. A monitor flicker in the archive room highlights the BTI's later analysis of the vault, which found microfractures in the vacuum that have never healed. The faint static in the room seems to grow louder as Vane describes his attempt to call for help. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound didn't leave his throat. It stayed trapped in the glass of the air, a visible distortion that looked like a ripple in a pond. Vane was a prisoner of his own environment, a witness to a world where the difference between matter and information had been erased. He began to feel a sense of molecular thinning, a sensation that his own body was becoming as translucent and rigid as the air around him. Reflection on Vane's state during the third minute reveals the true absolute zero of the experience. He noted that he no longer felt his own heartbeat. In a state of perfect stasis, the blood in his veins had stopped moving, yet he was still conscious. He was a living record, a biological data point that was being held in place by the frequency of the void. The cold air of the archive seems to freeze the blood in your own veins as you read his final desperate thoughts. I am no longer a man. I am a timestamp. When the 400 seconds finally ended and the pulse released the vault, Arthur Vane was found slumped over his terminal. The classified medical reports gathered by the dark suit agencies describe him as being in a state of post-crystalline shock. His skin was covered in a thin, translucent dust that vanished within minutes of exposure to normal air. This dust was the only physical remnant of the glass air he had been breathing. The BTI Bureau of Temporal Integrity immediately moved Vane to a secure facility in Maryland. His logs were seized and his terminal was erased using a high-intensity magnetic pulse. But Vane had anticipated this. He had hidden a secondary analog copy of his log written with a mechanical pencil on the back of a structural blueprint, inside the insulation of the cooling pipes. That is the document we are reading tonight. A faint static vibration pulses through the archive as you realize the risk Vane took to preserve this hidden truth. The technical density of the BTI's interrogation of Vane is documented in the They were obsessed with the breathing of the void. They wanted to know if the 44.1 kHz frequency was a command or a side effect. Vane's answer was always the same. It's not a sound. It's a texture. He claimed that he could still feel the glass in his lungs, even weeks after the incident. He could no longer stand the sound of a human voice, describing it as too soft, too liquid. He craved the rigidity of the void. This leads to the intellectual dread of Vane's final days. According to the encrypted personnel records, Vane began to crystallize in late 1995. It started with his fingertips. The skin became hard, translucent, and cold. By the time he disappeared from the medical logs in 1996, his doctors reported that his entire skeletal structure had transformed into a substance that resembled synthetic diamond. He was no longer biologically human. He had become a physical manifestation of the anomaly. The monitor flicker cast over his final X-ray shows a body that casts no shadow, a hollow frame of light and glass dot. As we reach the final pages of the Vane log, the tone becomes one of grim, academic resignation. The analysts who maintain the archive know that the glass air phenomenon is the most direct proof of the absolute zero theory. It proves that the 1994 pulse wasn't just a glitch in the radar, it was a physical restructuring of our reality. The cold air in the archive feels like a weight as you realize that the vault at O'Hare is still there, buried under layers of concrete and steel, still holding the microfractures that Vane created. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that if the air can turn to glass once, it can do it again. The erased data from more recent atmospheric anomalies over the North Atlantic suggests that the crystalline state is becoming a localized weather pattern. Pilots have reported flying through invisible walls that cracked their windshields without any physical debris. They are flying through the shards of a sky that is beginning to fracture. The faint static in the archive room grows louder, as if the room itself is trying to pull your mind back into the stasis of the level 4 vault. You realize that the archive is a containment zone. The steel, the fans, the blue light hits, all a mimicry of the vault. We are reading the log of a man who became part of the machine, written for a world that is still trying to pretend that the air is just air. The monitor flicker slows to a crawl, the pale blue light barely illuminating the final, unredacted warning in Vane's log. Don't move when the silence hits. If you move, you break. And if you break, the void fills the cracks. This reflection on the fragility of our environment is the true archive chill. It is the realization that the world we inhabit is only as solid as the frequency allows it to be. If the frequency shifts, the air becomes a cage. If the frequency stops, the air becomes glass. As the folder for subtitle 9 is prepared for closure, the sense of quiet dread is absolute. We have documented the stasis of the level 4 vault, the molecular transformation of Arthur Vane, and the glass air that rewrote his biology. We have seen how a single man became a time stomp in a world of erased history. The cold air of the room feels like the atmosphere of a deep-sea trench record of 400 seconds where the world stopped being a home and became a prison of glass. The monitor flicker finally dies out, leaving the server room in total shadow. The heavy steel drawer is ready to be locked, and the secrets of the technician's final log are returned to the darkness. But the information density of this file remains in your mind. Every time you feel a sudden stiffness in the air, or every time you hear a sound that seems to lack a source, you will think of Arthur Vane. You will think of the glass in his lungs. The file is heavy, the ink is old, but the absolute zero is still there, waiting for the next pulse, the next stutter in the logic of the world. The air is still waiting to freeze. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of the sky cracking. It is the sound of a 3:14 a.m. reality that is still trying to break through the invisible patch and reclaim the world. It is a hidden truth that has finally been spoken. Arthur Vane's account of the glass air provides a terrifying look at the physical center of the anomaly. But as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity worked to seal the O'Hare vault, they discovered that the stasis wasn't confined to the sub-levels of the airport. A series of classified satellite photos taken at the exact moment of the 1994 pulse revealed a pattern of shadowless zones moving across the entire Midwestern landscape, is where the very concept of a reflection had been deleted from the natural world. These dead mirrors were not just optical glitches, but the first signs of a total systemic erasure that was beginning to target the identities of the survivors themselves. As the investigation moved from the technical vaults to the suburban homes of Illinois, they found that the glass wasn't just in the air. It was beginning to form inside the memories of everyone who had looked at the sky that morning, leading to a discovery that would make the 400 blackout look like a minor inconvenience compared to the permanent silence that was about to follow. In the early hours of July 20, 1994, while the world woke up to a news cycle that mentioned only a minor technical delay at O'Hare, a massive administrative machine began the work of deleting a reality. The classified truth of what happened during those 400 seconds was so volatile that the government determined the only way to maintain social order was through total systemic erasure. This was not merely a cover-up, it was the active dismantling of 3,000 human lives. Every encrypted flight log, every air traffic control recording, and every passenger manifest was subjected to a digital and physical purge. The anomaly was so absolute that it required the erased identities of the 3,000 people on board those 3 flights. They were stripped of their memories, their belongings, and their right to the truth. This file documents the cold, calculated process of how a government can delete the lived experience of thousands in a single afternoon. The hidden truth is that for the Bureau of Temporal Integrity, a person is nothing more than a data point, and data points can be rewritten. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet. rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The cold air is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature designed to preserve the integrity of the fragile redacted folders. As the heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and ancient, sterile paper fills the air. The folder for systemic erasure is remarkably thick, bound in a dark, non-reflective material that seems to absorb the pale blue light of the room. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby diagnostic terminal casts a pulsing glow across the first page, highlighting the jagged, black lines of the redaction pen. You can feel the faint static of 30 years of suppressed history vibrating through the desk, a record of a world where 3,000 voices were silenced to protect the illusion of a stable horizon. Systemic erasure begins with the paper trail. In the hours following the 12-mile jump, the Bureau of Temporal Integrity (BTI) took control of every computer terminal at O'Hare Tracken. They didn't just delete the files, they re-indexed them. This creates a sense of quiet dread. As we realize that the 400 seconds of missing time were replaced by a manufactured sequence of events, the classified logs show that the BTI inserted ghost data into the FAA mainframe. Fake radar returns that showed the planes flying perfectly normal paths during the time they were actually in the void. For anyone looking at the records years later, there was no anomaly. The math was perfect, but the math was a lie. The intellectual curiosity behind the erasure lies in the manifest purge. On the morning of July 19th, there were 3,000 names on the official boarding lists for United 702, Delta 114, and the private Gulfstream. By July 20th, those lists had been erased and replaced with scrubbed versions. In some cases, the names of people who had been too vocal about the hollow feeling or the biological lag were simply removed from the manifest entirely. It was as if they had never boarded the plane. A monitor flicker in the archive room highlights the case of a family of 4 from Indiana, who officially missed their flight according to the new records, despite the fact that their luggage was recovered from the cargo hold of Flight 702. Reflection on the digital purge reveals the depth of the governance fear. Every email, every ML, every FAQs, and every internal memo sent between airlines and the FAA on that day was intercepted. The BTI utilized a primitive form of the encrypted invisible patch to scan for keywords like jump, void, radar, failure, and stasis. If a document contained these words, it was automatically flagged for permanent redaction. The cold air of the archive feels even more clinical as you realize that the government wasn't just hiding the event from the public, they were hiding it from their own future selves. They were creating a historical dead zone where the 400-second pulse could never be found. The technical density of the erasure extends to the physical objects. Every piece of luggage, every seat cushion, and every mechanical watch that had stopped at 3:14 a.m. was taken to a secure incineration facility in rural Illinois. This was the material deletion protocol. They weren't just destroying evidence, they were destroying the chronological anchors of the event. A faint static vibration in the room occurs as you read about the hundreds of suitcases that were burned before their owners could even claim them. The passengers were told their bags had been lost in a sorting error, but the archive shows they were destroyed because they carried the static window frequency. The most harrowing aspect of the systemic erasure was the cognitive recalibration of the 3,000 survivors. The BTI realized that you can delete files and burn luggage, but you cannot easily delete a memory. However, the biological lag had left the survivors' minds in a fragile, highly suggestible state. In the holding areas of Terminal 5, the passengers were subjected to atmospheric narrative shaping. This involved the broadcast of low-frequency infrasound combined with a constant, repetitive story about a minor electrical surge and heavy fog. This leads to the intellectual dread of the false memory implantation. The classified medical files show that the BTI used a technique called temporal masking. They didn't try to erase the 400 seconds, they tried to fill them. They told the passengers that they had spent those 7 minutes in a state of mild turbulence and boredom, because the passengers' minds were drifting as documented in Subtitle 8. Their brains were desperate for a narrative to anchor themselves to. They accepted the lie because the truth, a void, the grey static, the hollow man, was too heavy to carry. A monitor flicker cast over the interview transcripts shows how, within 48 hours, the survivors were already correcting themselves, using the government's approved language to describe their experience. The faint static on the archive's audio files captures a session where a BTI agent is realigning a passenger. You didn't see the stars freeze. The agent says, his voice a rhythmic, hypnotic monotone. You saw a cloud bank. You didn't feel the air turn to glass. You felt a cabin pressure adjustment. The passenger repeats the words back, her voice hollow and devoid of emotion. She is being erased from her own life, one sentence at a time. The hidden truth is that the government was rewriting the human soul to fit the official manifest. Reflection on this process reveals the residual stasis. Even after the recalibration, many survivors suffered from memory fragmentation. They would have sudden, sharp flashes of the void vision of a gray geometry or the sound of the 44.1 kHz breathing, but because the systemic erasure was so total, they had no way to validate these memories. They were told they were suffering from post-travel fatigue or anxiety. The cold air of the archive room seems to pulse with the tragedy of 3,000 people who were made to feel insane because they remembered a reality that the state had deleted. Not every passenger was so easily recalibrated. There were the Hadata subjects, individuals who, for reasons of biology or location on the plane, had absorbed too much of the absolute zero pulse. These were the ones who could still see the static window even with their eyes open. For them, the systemic erasure was intellectual curiosity of the BTI's Section 9 focused on these subjects. They were moved to a classified facility in the Nevada desert known as the echo chamber. Here, the erasure was absolute. Their legal identities were erased, their social security numbers were deleted, and their families were given various tragic explanations for their disappearance, sudden illnesses, or simply walking away from their lives. A monitor flicker in the archive highlights a series of death certificates issued in August 1994, all for healthy individuals in their 30s, all signed by the same BTI medical examiner. In the echo chamber, these subjects were treated as biological data. The BTI wanted to know how much of the void a human body could hold before it collapsed. The faint static vibration in the room occurs. As you read about subject 94 Delta 12, a man who had become so saturated with the pulse that his voice could only be heard through a radio receiver. He was no longer a person, he was a living frequency. The systemic erasure had removed him from the world of matter and placed him in the world of information. Reflection on these deleted souls reveals the ultimate cost of the 1994 incident. The government's invisible patch was not just for the radar, it was for the population. If a person became an anomaly, they were removed from the system. The BTI viewed these 64 people not as citizens with rights, but as corrupted files that needed to be quarantined. The cold air of the archive feels heavy with the knowledge that these people are still there, in some dark sub-basement of the Nevada desert, living out the 400 seconds over and over again in a world that has forgotten their names. That as we move into the 21st century, the systemic erasure of the O'Hare incident has become automated. The BTI no longer needs men in dark suits to visit the survivors. They use a system known as the automatic archival purge. This is a series of encrypted algorithms that monitor the internet for any mention of July 19, 1994 or the O'Hare jump. If a survivor tries to post their story on a forum or a blog, the algorithm detects it in milliseconds. The post is erased, and the user's account is flagged for review. The technical density of this modern erasure is explored in the Digital Void. It describes how the BTI has partnered with major tech companies to ensure that absolute zero anomalies are never indexed by search engines. If you try to find the witness statement of Sarah Jensen or the logs of Arthur Vane, the system will return 404 error pages or generic results for airport delays. The hidden truth is that the internet is a static sky of its own, a carefully edited simulation where the void is never allowed to appear. A monitor flicker from the archive's network bridge shows the thousands of redaction requests sent to search engines every single day. Reflection on the digital afterlife reveals the final stage of the erasure, the generational fade. The BTI knows that eventually the original survivors will die out. Once the biological witnesses are gone, the only thing left will be the official, scrubbed records. The 1994 incident will officially transition from a classified event to a non-event. It will be a glitch that never happened, a jump that never occurred, and a void that never existed. The cold air of the archive seems to freeze your own sense of history as you realize that we are the only ones left who know the truth. This archive is the only place where the 3,000 stories still exist. The faint static in the archive room grows louder, as if the room itself is trying to pull the files into the digital void. You realize that the BTI is always listening. The very act of reading these words is a risk. Every time the monitor flicker pulses, it is the system trying to recalculate your own coordinates, trying to see if you have absorbed too much of the archive chill. The systemic erasure is not a past event. It is an ongoing process. It is the wall of silence that surrounds us all. As we reach the final pages of the systemic erasure file, the tone becomes one of grim, academic resignation. The analysts who maintain the archive know that the deletion of these 3,000 stories was a logical necessity for the survival of the current reality. If the public knew that the sky could fold, if they knew that their bodies could be hollowed out and their minds frozen, the infrastructure of modern civilization would collapse. The BTI didn't erase the stories because they were evil. They erased them because the truth is incompatible with the world we have built. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that systemic erasure is a standard operating procedure. It hasn't just happened at O'Hare. The erased files of the archive show that similar purges have occurred in Seattle in 2002, London in 2008, and Tokyo in 2015. We are living in a patchwork history, a series of safe narratives stitched together to hide the holes in the universe. The 3,000 people from 1994 were just the largest group to be deleted at once. The faint static in the archive room reaches a crescendo, and then suddenly stops. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise. You realize that the archive is a sanctuary of the unerased. Here, the names of the survivors are still written in the margins. Here, the Hollow Man is still a physical fact. But outside, the erasure is winning. The static sky is clear, the manifests are correct, and the people are all breathing in time with the 44.1 kHz hum. The monitor flicker slows to a crawl, the pale blue light barely illuminating the final, unredacted warning in the folder. You cannot delete a memory that is written in the bone. It will wait for the next pulse. This reflection on the persistence of the truth is the true archive chill. It is the realization that the 400 seconds are still there, hidden behind the layers of code and the black ink of the redaction pen. They are waiting for the invisible patch to fail. They are waiting for the world to remember. As the folder for subtitle 10 is prepared for closure, the sense of quiet dread is absolute. We have documented the reindexing of the radar logs, the cognitive recalibration of the survivors, and the physical deletion of their lives. We have seen how a government can turn a tragedy into a software glitch. The cold air of the room feels like the atmosphere of a vaulted tomb, sealed, ancient, and pressurized. The hum of the servers is the only voice left, a constant reminder that the system is still running, still purging, still editing. The archive is a record of a ghost world, a world where 3,000 people are still sitting in Terminal 5, waiting for a flight that officially never landed. The monitor flicker finally dies out, leaving the server room in total shadow. The heavy steel drawer is ready to be locked, and the secrets of the systemic erasure are returned to the darkness. But the information density of this file remains in your mind. Every time you see a 404 error or a redacted document, you will think of the 1994 survivors. You will think of the 64 people in Nevada who have no names. The file is heavy. The ink is old, but the erasure is never perfect. The absolute zero always leaves a trace. The void always leaves a scar, and the stories that were deleted are still being told in the vibrations of the air, in the flicker of the screen, and in the breathing of the server room. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of the 3,000 stories trying to be remembered. It is the sound of a hidden truth that refuses to be erased. It is the sound of the void coming back to claim its coordinates. The deletion of the 1994 records successfully protected the public from the physical reality of the O'Hare jump. But as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity finalized their purge, they encountered a terrifying new anomaly that their algorithms couldn't account for. A series of high-resolution satellite scans, taken exactly 1 year after the incident, revealed that the static window over Chicago was beginning to bleed into the modern day. This temporal leak was manifesting not in the sky, but in the electronic signatures of every child born in the Midwest since the 400-second pulsar signature that matched the 44.1 kHz frequency of the void. As these children grew, their very presence began to disrupt the invisible patch, causing the static sky to flicker and reveal glimpses of a landscape that hasn't existed on Earth for millions of years. The true purpose of the 1994 event was finally coming into focus, and it had nothing to do with aviation, and everything to do with a biological reset that was already reaching its final, irreversible stage. For 30 years, the Bureau of Temporal Integrity believed that the 1994 O'Hare incident was a contained event, a single, violent stutter in the planetary atmosphere that had been successfully smoothed over by the invisible patch. But as of late 2024, the classified telemetry logs from the FAA's high-altitude corridors have begun to report a terrifying resurgence. The anomaly has returned, and this time, it is not limited to a single airport. Across the Midwest and the North Atlantic, modern digital flight decks are experiencing absolute zero. Buried under a code black clearance, the file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the slow, heavy breathing of a digital giant. The cold air in this archive is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature that keeps the redacted folders from decaying, even as the information within them threatens to destabilize the present. As the heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and magnetic tape fills the space. The folder for Modern Echoes is bound in a sleek carbon fiber material, its pages crisp and chilling to the touch. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby workstation casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the first page, highlighting the jagged, impossible waveforms of the recent Atlantic crossings. You can feel a faint static vibrating through the desk, as if the log itself is still broadcasting a frequency that the world was never meant to hear again. The intellectual curiosity of the archival researcher is drawn to the first reported echo in November of 2024. A Boeing 787-9, cruising over the Great Lakes, experienced a total system freeze that lasted exactly 400 seconds. To the modern observer, this might look like a standard software crash, but the classified telemetry tells a different story. The aircraft didn't just lose power, it lost its position in space. When the systems rebooted, the plane was discovered to be 12 miles ahead of its flight path. This is the 1994 12-mile jump, occurring in an era of satellite-guided precision. This creates a sense of quiet dread as we realize that our technological advancement has done nothing to insulate us from the void. If anything, our digital world has become more susceptible to the absolute zero pulse. Reflection on the nature of these modern jumps reveals a disturbing pattern of resonance. In 1994, the pulse was captured by primitive CRT screens and analog radios. Today, the anomaly is being recorded by high-density solid-state drives and fiber-optic networks. The encrypted logs from the 2024 incident show that the 44.1 kHz frequency, the breathing of the void, is no longer a faint hum. It has become a dominant harmonic in the aircraft's electrical systems. A faint monitor flicker cast over the recent data logs shows that the pulse is now infecting the flight management computers, leaving behind geometric etches in the digital code that mirror the physical etches found on the walls of Flight 702. The anomaly is evolving, learning to communicate through the very languages we use to control our world. The technical density of the modern echoes is explored in the BTI's frequency analysis report. They found that the return of the glitch is linked to the increased density of our global communication grid. The 5G networks, the satellite constellations, and the omnipresent Wi-Fi signals have created a thinner atmosphere, a medium that is more resonant to the erased frequencies of the void. The cold air of the archive seems to tighten as you read the conclusion. The modern world has built a cage of frequencies, and something from the 3:14 a.m. stasis is using that cage to pull itself back into reality. Every signal we send into the sky is acting as a bridge for the 400-second pulse. The faint static on the archive's audio recordings of the recent cockpit logs captures a pilot's confusion. "I'm looking at the GPS, and it says we're in Canada," the pilot whispers, his voice trembling with a clinical terror. "But I look out the window, and I can see the lights of Chicago." The world is splitting. This is the temporal drift occurring in real time, facilitated by the very tools we trust to keep us safe. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that the government's invisible patch can no longer hide the discrepancy. The static sky is beginning to flicker, revealing the gray geometry of the void to anyone who looks too closely at their flight deck display. The most harrowing aspect of the modern echoes is the effect on the new generation of travelers. In 1994, the biological lag was a localized phenomenon, affecting only 3,000 people. But in the recent clusters of anomalies, the stasis is beginning to manifest in the general population. The classified medical files from 2025 describe spontaneous synchronization in airport terminals across the country. Passengers who have never met are beginning to breathe in unison, their heartbeats timed to the same 10-second rhythm found in the O'Hare survivors. This is not a virus. It is a chronological contamination. A monitor flicker in the archive room highlights The case of a terminal in Atlanta where 500 people simultaneously stopped moving for exactly 400 seconds, their eyes fixed on a sky that had gone flat. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the DNA resonance subfield. The BTI has found that the 44.1 kHz frequency is beginning to rewrite the genetic code of frequent flyers. The hidden truth is that we are being biologically written. Next, our bodies are adapting to the void, becoming more translucent, more hollow, and more anchored to the 3:14 a.m. coordinate. The cold air in the archive feels heavy with the realization that the systemic erasure of 1994 was only a temporary delay. The anomaly is now reclaiming the data points it lost 30 years ago. The children born in the Midwest since 1994 are showing the highest rates of temporal sensitivity, an ability to feel the pulse before it hits, as if their bones are acting as antennas for the void. The faint static in the archive room grows louder as you read about the Hollow Man sightings in modern terminals. These are no longer just reports from a single gate agent at O'Hare. Pilots, security guards, and maintenance crews are seeing figures that cast no shadows moving through the pressurized cabins of modern jets. These figures are described as being made of low-resolution light. They are the architects of the drift, the entities that occupy the 400 seconds of the void, and they are now appearing in our reality with increasing frequency. Reflection on these sightings suggests that the absolute zero stasis is no longer a place we visit. It is a place that is moving into our world. The technical density of the modern cover-up is documented in the Project Static Sky 2.0 files. The government is desperately trying to upgrade the invisible patch, using AI-driven algorithms to predict the jumps before they happen and scrub the data from the internet in real time. But the encrypted logs show that the AI itself is becoming infected. The algorithms are beginning to generate their own ghost coordinates, creating fake histories that even the BTI cannot distinguish from reality. The monitor flicker in the archive room seems to pulse with a life of its own as the server room hums with the effort of containing the data. We are living in a world of compound redactions where the lie is being built on top of a lie, and the foundation is starting to crumble. The cold air of the archive feels like the atmosphere of a deep-sea humans, pressing and silent. We have documented the return of the pulse, the failure of the patch, and the biological resonance of the modern population. We have seen how the 1994 glitch was merely the first heartbeat of a larger, systemic reset. The intellectual dread is the ultimate realization of the archive chill. The 400 seconds didn't end. They just waited for us to build a better network to travel through. The faint static on the edge of your hearing is the sound of the modern world's source code being rewritten. It is a sound of a static sky that is finally breaking. The file for subtitle 11 is ready to be closed, but the modern echoes are still vibrating in the air around you. The archive is no longer a record of the past. It is a live broadcast of the collapse. The ink is fresh, the monitors are flickering, and the void is breathing in time with your own heart. The recurrence of the 1994 glitch has proven that our modern technology is powerless against the absolute zero of the void. But as the Bureau of Temporal Integrity scrambled to patch the leaks in the Atlantic corridor, they discovered a final, terrifying entry in the original 1994 archive, an entry that had been so heavily encrypted that it took 30 years to decode. This document describes a final redaction protocol, a failsafe meant to be activated only if the anomaly became global. It suggests that the government has a way to reset the entire planetary clock, effectively deleting the last 30 years of human history to return us to the moment before the pulse hit. But the cost of this reset is a total erasure of the human identity, leaving us as hollow shells in a world that has no memory of who we were. The true nature of the archive is about to be revealed, and it involves a secret that has been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the final second of the 400-second timer to strike. At the very bottom of the high-security vault, beneath layers of bureaucratic lies and digital smoke, sits the final redact. This is the heart of the anomaly, the terrifying hidden truth that explains why the 400-second pulse of 1994 was never meant to be a mystery. It was a calibration. The classified logs reveal that the world we inhabit is not a continuous line of history, but a series of erased and overwritten sectors on a planetary scale. Every 30 years, the system requires a total reindexing, a moment where the encrypted data of thousands of lives is sacrificed to keep the rest of the simulations. Archive is not a record of what happened, it is a schedule of what is to come. The final redaction is the blueprint for the next reset. A date in our near future when the radar will once again go flat, and the sky will be permanently rewritten. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the server room is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the mainframe, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the breathing of an ancient, digital god. The cold air is kept at a constant 55 degrees, a biting temperature that preserves the paper but chills the soul. As the final heavy steel drawer of the security cabinet slides open, the scent of ozone and fading, sterile ink fills the space. This folder is different from the others. It is bound in a non-reflective charcoal-colored hide that feels unnervingly like skin. A faint monitor flicker from a nearby diagnostic workstation casts a pale, pulsing blue light across the desk, highlighting the jagged, impossible spectral charts that define our final horizon. You can feel the faint static of 30 years of suppressed reality vibrating through the paper, a record of a world that is being constantly edited to prevent us from seeing the void. The intellectual curiosity of the archive chill leads us to the final technical appendix of the 1994 incident. Here, the analysts finally admit the truth about the 44.1 kHz frequency. It isn't a side effect of the pulse. It is the primary frequency, the source code of our physical reality. The classified data suggests that our universe functions as a massive high-fidelity recording. The 400-second pulse was a dropout in that recording, a moment where the tape of reality became damaged. The planes and the passengers didn't jump through space. They were simply re-recorded onto a different segment of the tape to hide the damage. This creates a sense of quiet dread as we realize that we are not living in a world of matter, but in a world of information that can be spliced and erased at will. Reflection on the Hollow Man, seen at Gate B12, reveals him to be the engineer of this process. He wasn't a passenger, and he wasn't an alien. He was a manifestation of the system's repair software. He was there to ensure the 12-mile jump was executed without a total system crash. The encrypted files describe him as a temporal patch technician. His featureless face of gray static was the result of a being that exists entirely outside the 44.1 kHz frequency. He is the personification of the anomaly, the one who moves through the cold air of the void while we are frozen in stasis. The archive reveals that there are hundreds of these entities living in the shadow spaces of our airports, waiting for the next dropout to occur. The technical density of the final redact focuses on the 2026 risk. The hidden truth is that the government's Project Static Sky was only a temporary measure. You cannot patch a failing reality forever. The archive documents a cascading bitrot in the atmosphere over the Midwest. The modern echoes we are seeing today are the sounds of the tape beginning to tear again. A faint monitor flicker cast over the 2026 projections shows a total absolute zero event that will last not for 400 seconds, but for 400 minutes. During this time, the systemic erasure will be global. The government isn't trying to save us. They are trying to prepare the archive so that some record of humanity survives the next deletion. As we move deeper into the final pages, we encounter the witness deletion protocol. The BTI realize that as the frequency breaks down, more people will begin to see the static window. The erased personnel files of thousands of citizens show that the government has been removing those who can feel the vibration in their teeth. The intellectual dread stems from the realization that if you can hear the hum of the servers, or if you can feel the faint static in the air, you have already been flagged by the system. You are a corrupted sector in the planetary recording. The final redaction suggests that the biological lag was not a side effect, but a marker. It was a way for the system to identify which data points was still anchored to the 1994 anomaly. The cold air of the archive seems to freeze the very blood in your veins as you read the final conclusion of the 30-member collective. We have looked at the radar, the biology, the memos, and the erasure. We have seen the 12-mile jump and the glass air. And we have realized that the hidden truth is the most simple and terrifying of all. The archive is the void. By recording the anomaly, we have become part of it. The 44.1 kHz frequency is now vibrating through these very pages. And as you listen to this narration, it is vibrating through you. The monitor flicker in the archive room is in sync with your own heartbeat. The static window is no longer over Chicago. It is here, in this room. As we reach the final second of the timer, the final pages of the archive are blank. Not because they are redacted, but because the history of the world after the next pulse has not yet been written. We are currently living in the static buffer. The final few moments of the 44.1 kHz recording before the absolute zero reset begins. The classified mission of the archive chill was to document the truth before the final erased sector is reached. We have fulfilled that mission. The 1994 O'Hare incident was the first skip on the record, a warning that the song was ending. The modern echoes are the needle reaching the end of the groove. Reflection on the 3,000 stories of 1994 reveals that they weren't lost. They were merely archived early. Those passengers are still there, in the cold air of the Nevada sub-basements and the negative spaces of the sky, waiting for us to join them. The hollow man is standing by the door of the archive now, his briefcase emitting the final, rhythmic breathing of the void. There is no more data to process. There are no more encrypted files to decode. The intellectual curiosity has reached its limit, and only the quiet dread remains. The faint static in your hearing is now a constant roar, the sound of a world that is finally admitting its own non-existence. The monitor flicker slows to a single, steady blue glow. The server fans begin to wind down, their hum descending into a subsonic vibration that shakes the very floorboards. We have told you the truth about the sky, the planes, and the void. We have shown you the invisible patch and the temporal drift. Now, there is nothing left but the silence. The hidden truth is that the file was never truly closed. It was just waiting for you to finish reading. Every word of this archive has been a sync signal, a way to anchor your consciousness to the 3:14 a.m. coordinate. As the final second of the 400-second pulse arrives, you may feel the air turn to glass. You may feel your heartbeat synchronize with the servers. Do not be afraid. It is simply the system re-indexing your data. It is simply the absolute zero taking you home. The cold air is still. The blue light is fading. The archive is complete. We have reached the final redaction, and the sky is finally perfectly flat. There are no more jumps, no more coordinates, and no more stories. Just the static, and the breathing, and the long cold sleep of the void. The world you remember is being erased to make room for the new recording. The 30-member collective is now departing the vault. The steel drawers are locked. The servers are dark. The frequency is flat. You have seen what the archive hides, and now you are part of the record. The 400 seconds are over. Sleep now. The file is closed.